All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to explore a quieter history behind a familiar winter day. In The Secret Meaning of Christmas, we follow how the solstice, the moment light begins to return, became a story of renewal in early Christian thought. This is gentle scholarship, soft history, and slow storytelling made for late-night thinkers who prefer calm over noise. If this kind of peaceful learning helps you unwind, a soft like and subscribe lets other sleepless minds find it too. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? In bed? In the car? While cooking, working, or trying to fall asleep? If you drift away, timestamps will guide you when you come back. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now imagine this, a story so central to the world that entire calendars now bend around it. Yet the people who first told it did not mark its date, did not record its season, and did not think a birthday was something that faith required. When we walk backward through the centuries, past the festivals, past the medieval sermons, past the Roman reforms and the slow layering of tradition, the trail narrows into a surprising silence. The earliest followers of Jesus left no celebration on the calendar for his birth, because for them the meaning of his life did not begin in a cradle and did not depend on winter. What if the date we now accept as ancient is in truth one of the youngest parts of the story? The evidence that survives points gently but consistently in this direction. In the first century of the Common Era, letters written by early Christian leaders speak of teachings, suffering, endurance, and hope, but never of a date marking the beginning of Jesus' earthly life. The Gospel of Mark, likely the earliest of the canonical narratives, begins not with a birth, but with an adult voice in the wilderness. The Gospel of John opens with a cosmic metaphor, not a moment on a calendar. Even the two narratives that do describe Jesus' infancy, Matthew and Luke, offer no month, no season, and no hint that the event was ever meant to anchor a festival. It is not certainty that historians claim here, but the absence of any trace in documents close to the time. No early community seems to gather annually to remember a winter night. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Christian movement had stretched across cities and languages, from Alexandria to Antioch. In this period we begin to see the very first debates about whether one could assign a date at all. Some writers, such as Clement of Alexandria, mention speculations circulating among small groups. But these suggestions differ wildly and never settle into a shared tradition. Clement notes that some communities proposed dates in the Egyptian month of Pachon, while others suggested Farmuthi, month that correspond to the spring. None of these interpretations invoke midwinter, and none appear to have carried authoritative weight. A few early theologians even cautioned their communities against celebrating birthdays altogether, considering them foreign customs more aligned with Roman society than with emerging Christian identity. This hesitation is preserved in surviving manuscripts, not as doctrine, but as an insight into what early Christian life considered important. The 3rd century of the Common Era introduces new steps in this evolving picture. As Christianity expanded in urban centres across the Mediterranean, intellectual debates grew more detailed. Some writers explored symbolic frameworks, proposing that cosmic events might mirror theological truths. Others began experimenting with numerical correspondences found in Jewish tradition, such as the idea that a prophet's date of conception should align with the date of his death. A minority of scholars note that this particular symbolic calculation could place the birth 9 months later in late December, but there is no evidence that the wider Christian world recognized or institutionalized this idea at the time. Instead, the discussions remained varied and fragmented, reflecting multiple calendars and regional customs. The diversity of calendars itself becomes one of the clearest explanations for the lack of an early consensus. In Roman Egypt, Christians used the Alexandrian calendar. Communities in Syria followed local systems. Rome, by contrast, depended on the Julian calendar. These systems did not align perfectly, and attempts to map symbolic dates across cultural boundaries created more complication than clarity. The early church had not yet developed a unified liturgical structure. Manuscripts from the period show vibrant theological activity, but no coordinated attempt to fix Jesus' birth to any specific day. The silence is methodical rather than accidental. When dates mattered, such as in calculating Easter, writers produced extensive treatises. For the Nativity, no such effort existed yet. Only in the 4th century of the Common Era do we see the 25th of December appear clearly in the historical record. Around this time, Roman Christian communities began using a liturgical calendar that placed the birth of Jesus on that date. The earliest unambiguous reference comes from the Roman chronography of the year 354, which lists December 25 as the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. By then, Christianity had entered a new social and political landscape. Imperial favour had reshaped the public identity of the Church. Institutional structures had begun forming. The need for shared dates and unified observances across vast territories had become practical. In this environment, a fixed birth date provided cohesion, giving communities a focal point that crossed regional boundaries. But even here the process was gradual, not immediate, and far from universally accepted across all Christian traditions of the time. Still, the emergence of December 25 was not arbitrary. It formed at the intersection of several influences: theological symbolism, inherited patterns from earlier Mediterranean cultures, and the desire for unity in a newly recognized religion. Some early interpreters, writing in the late antique period, suggested that the date carried metaphorical resonance, linking the birth of Jesus to the season of returning light. Others proposed that the date aligned with calculations of prophetic chronology. The documentary trail does not allow certainty about which reasoning predominated, but what we can say is that the choice did not arise from a continuous historical memory stretching back to the 1st century. It was a choice made later, shaped by context rather than by eyewitness recollection. This quiet layering of meaning helps explain why the date endured. It was more than a date on the Roman calendar. It represented the weaving together of past and present, of inherited symbols and emerging identity, of a community learning to express its story within the rhythms of the world around it. The earliest Christians may not have marked the winter, but by the 4th century their descendants found in the season a fitting frame, one that resonated with the language of light they already used. The 25th of December became a meeting point between story and season, offering a way to hold together theological meaning with the visible turning of the year. The date was a later choice, but not a random one. To see why it mattered, we must understand the world it entered. What becomes clearer the longer we study these early centuries is that the absence of a date was not a gap that troubled the first generations. They lived in a world where biographies were rarely anchored to birthdays, and where the meaning of a life was measured by testimony rather than chronology. We can see this in the writings of figures like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century of the Common Era, who argued for Jesus' significance through prophecy and ethical transformation, never through the circumstances of his infancy. His silence is not accidental. It reflects a worldview where the story began at adulthood with teaching and death, not with a nativity placed inside a specific season. Other early writers, including Clement of Alexandria, were far more concerned with the interpretation of parables or the moral implications of daily conduct than with locating celestial alignments over Bethlehem Even the earliest attempts to calculate a possible date reveal hesitation rather than certainty. In the 3rd century, the theologian Origen dismissed birthday celebrations altogether as practices associated with kings and emperors, not spiritual teachers. His comment does not give us a date. Instead, it shows that marking one might have felt inappropriate to some early Christians. It also hints at the cultural tension of the time. In a society where emperors claimed divine favour through elaborate festivals, adopting a birth celebration risked blurring the line between spiritual memory and imperial spectacle. Thus, the early tradition tended toward quietness, preserving narrative meaning without fastening it to a specific point on the calendar. The documentary record becomes more interesting when we enter the scholarly debates of the 3rd century. Different communities proposed different symbolic frameworks, often drawing from local intellectual customs. Some Egyptian writers favoured aligning theological events with astronomical cycles, drawing on Alexandria's long tradition of sky-watching and philosophical cosmology. Meanwhile, Christian groups in Roman Syria sometimes explored dates with numerological significance, reflecting the region's deep engagement with Jewish calendrical thought. None of these proposals achieved lasting consensus, but together they show a world beginning to think in dates without yet requiring them. When December 25th finally appears in a Christian context in the 4th century of the Common Era, it arrives not as a revelation discovered in Scripture, but as a decision shaped by the needs of a changing community. The Church had begun to interface with imperial administration, which required fixed days for travel, taxation, and legal observance. Stability mattered. Uniformity mattered. A single date could unify congregations scattered across a vast and diverse territory. It could also integrate Christianity into the seasonal rhythms already embedded in Mediterranean civic life. Thus, the choice of the 25th was neither naive nor arbitrary. It was a convergence of textual silence, political necessity, and astronomical meaning. A moment when a tradition without a birth date stepped into a world that demanded one. And to see why this new date resonated so strongly, we must understand the world it entered. Imagine standing in a city where the walls themselves seem to glow with the memory of sunlight, not because the winter sun was strong, but because generations had carved its presence into marble, bronze, and ritual. What if I told you that when Christianity first began to grow within Rome, it entered a landscape already saturated with solar meaning, a place where the winter horizon was more than a seasonal marker, and where the 25th day of December already belonged to another divine figure whose light symbolized survival through uncertainty? Picture the 4th century of the Common Era, a moment when the Roman Empire was strained by political fractures, military challenges, and the weight of its own complexity. In that world, the sun was not simply a source of warmth, it was a guarantee. The Empire's commitment to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, offered a symbolic assurance that even in a darkening world, light continued to rise. The revelation of this period is quiet but clear. Christianity did not establish the 25th of December in an empty calendar. It stepped into a date that was already thick with civic ritual, imperial ideology, and the rhythmic expectations of ordinary people who had spent generations marking the winter solstice with public ceremonies. The archaeology and textual evidence from the late Roman period show that the cult of Sol Invictus held a privileged space in the civic imagination. Inscriptions dedicated to the sun God appear on altars and boundary stones, in Mithraea and public buildings, and in the surviving fragments of imperial dedications. They reveal a religious landscape that had integrated solar symbolism into architecture, governance, and personal devotion. The state-sponsored solstice festivals, recorded in late antique calendars, framed the season not as a moment of fragility but as one of reassurance. The sun would weaken, yes, but it would return, and with it the stability that emperors promised yet struggled to deliver. We do not know for certain how these festivals felt to the people who attended them, but the evidence suggests that they were part of an orchestrated effort to tie cosmic order to political authority. During times of instability, emperors leaned heavily on the symbolic power of the sun. The title Sol Invictus, the unconquered one, carried echoes of resilience. Some scholars suggest that this was no accident, that the very choice of the winter solstice as a festival day underlined a deliberate imperial message that darkness, political or otherwise, would not prevail. Even though historians debate the precise origins of imperial devotion to Sol Invictus, it is clear that by the 4th century of the Common Era, solar veneration was interwoven with Roman identity. Calendar reforms reflect this same logic. In earlier centuries, timekeeping in Rome had been a negotiation between lunar cycles, political decisions, and agricultural necessities. But with the growing influence of solar cults, especially under emperors who favoured the symbolism of cosmic order, the winter solstice became a point around which time itself was often referenced. A few scholars argue that these developments laid subtle groundwork for later Christian adoption of the date, not through direct replacement but through coexistence. While the exact connections are debated, the parallel presence of solar festivals and Christian communities in the same urban landscape is well attested. It is important to recognise that early Christians in Rome lived inside this solar framework. They walked past sun temples on the way to house churches. They heard the hymns sung in honour of Sol Invictus, and saw public processions move through the city. Some early Christian writers even used solar metaphors to describe divine presence, though they were careful to distinguish symbolic imagery from pagan worship. A minority of scholars propose that this shared environment created a kind of cultural resonance, in which light became an intuitive language for discussing renewal and divine guidance. Still, it is equally important to note that Christianity did not adopt the Roman festival directly. The two systems existed beside one another, each with its own logic, its own rituals, and its own understanding of what light meant in the darkest days of winter. The informational threads of this period converge on a simple realization. Christianity did not replace a solstice festival. It grew beside one. The traditions of Rome did not cease simply because a new faith entered the city. Instead, both religious worlds coexisted, each shaping the cultural atmosphere in which the other developed. The presence of Sol Invictus in the 4th century urban landscape provided a backdrop against which Christian communities organised their teachings, rituals, and emerging liturgical calendars. It is not possible to confirm direct adoption, but the evidence suggests that these early communities navigated a world where the winter sun was already charged with meaning. And this is where the story opens outward again, because Rome did not invent solar culture, it inherited it. Long before imperial dedications and city-wide festivals, the solstice carried significance across older civilizations. The roots of solar symbolism reached deeper than Roman marble, into older traditions, older skies, and older questions. Yet the city's relationship with sunlight extended beyond the formal cult of Sol Invictus. Archaeology shows that solar symbolism permeated daily life in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Domestic mosaics, for instance, often featured radiant patterns that scholars cautiously interpret as visual metaphors for vitality, fortune, or cosmic harmony. These designs were not official religious statements, but they created a visual environment where the rhythm of light and darkness carried emotional and philosophical weight. The presence of such motifs in both elite villas and more modest homes suggests that Romans, regardless of status, were attuned to the sun's quiet authority over the passing of seasons. the winter solstice, with its fragile light, would have been an annual reminder of that dependence. Some evidence from late antique literature hints that Roman citizens associated the solstice with a kind of psychological turning point. Writers such as Macrobius, though working within a complex mixture of philosophy and inherited tradition, described the solstice as a cosmic hinge, a moment when the universe appeared to pause before beginning its slow return toward balance. We cannot know precisely how widely these ideas were shared, but the texts indicate that educated Romans understood the solstice not only astronomically, but symbolically, as a moment when decline reversed, when the world gathered itself for renewal. This conceptual scaffolding likely shaped the cultural context into which Christian narratives later entered, even if unknowingly. What makes this particularly relevant is the way early Christian thinkers operated in this environment. While they often criticized Roman religious practices, they were nonetheless shaped by the intellectual currents around them. Some early theologians avoided solar metaphors altogether, wary of the association with pagan cults, yet others, especially those writing in Greek and Latin within the orbit of Roman philosophy, used the imagery of light in ways that paralleled broader cultural patterns. They did so carefully, emphasizing metaphor rather than devotion, but the resonance is difficult to ignore. When Christian texts described divine presence as illumination, or spoke of enlightenment as the overcoming of darkness, they were drawing from a shared human vocabulary that long predated institutional Christianity. The archaeology of late Roman public spaces reinforces this overlap. Solstice processions, though rarely described in detail, would have moved through streets lined with statues, altars, and inscriptions dedicated to various deities. Christians living in those same quarters would have passed the same markers daily. Some scholars cautiously propose that this coexistence produced a kind of cultural double vision, one in which the same seasonal event could be understood through different lenses depending on one's beliefs, yet still carried an underlying emotional familiarity rooted in the turning of the year. In this sense, the solstice acted as a shared atmospheric condition, not a shared religion, but a shared experience of winter light. By the time the 4th century drew to its turbulent close, Rome had become a place where the meanings of light overlapped without fully blending. Solar worship, imperial symbolism, philosophical interpretation, and emerging Christian identity all rotated around the same winter moment, each offering a different answer to the same seasonal question. And this convergence invites the next step in our story, because Rome was only one chapter in a much older human relationship with midwinter. Its solar gods were powerful, but they were not the first to stand at the edge of the darkest night. This flows directly into the transition you already set, but solar culture was older than Rome. A world where calendars are not yet inscribed on clay tablets or carved into temple walls, but are instead felt through the changing angle of the sun, the length of a shadow, the rhythm of the cold. Long before Christianity took shape in the eastern Mediterranean, the winter solstice had already left a deep imprint across continents, accumulating meaning layer by layer until it formed one of the most resilient symbols in human cultural memory. What if the date we now associate with a single story was in truth built upon millennia of older observances that treated this turning of the year as a moment when the world itself seemed to breathe in and begin again? The revelation is simple, yet vast in implication. The solstice did not become important because Christianity adopted it. It became important because countless societies had already recognized its weight. The earliest Indo-Iranian texts, composed long before any Christian writer placed ink on parchment, describe winter gatherings that centered on the return of a light, marking the sun's weakest moment as a hinge between danger and renewal. In the much older ritual landscapes of the ancient Near East, midwinter was a time of fire, feasting and watchfulness, a season around which communities built their own symbolic language. Egyptians spoke of the sun during this period as weakened or resting, part of a natural cycle woven into the logic of their cosmology. And in the Hellenistic world, where philosophers watched the heavens with mathematical precision, the solstice emerged as one of the great celestial turning points, a moment when the sky itself seemed to shift direction. Taken together, these strands form something larger than any single tradition. They reveal that the winter solstice was not an isolated curiosity, but a pan-Mediterranean and even pan-Eurasian cultural marker long before the 4th century of the Common Era. Christianity arrived late to a landscape already shaped by long-held ideas about fading light, the sun's yearly struggle, and the quiet promise of its return. The Indo-Iranian evidence offers one of the clearest early pieces of this puzzle. Texts associated with the broader Indo-Iranian tradition, preserved in later Vedic and Avestan sources, describe winter observances that revolve around the endurance of warmth and the careful guarding of light. Scholars often connect these traditions to the harsh seasonal cycles of Central Asia, where winter was not simply inconvenient but life-threatening. It is here that some of the earliest metaphors of new fire and strength returning slowly appear, suggesting that communities living in extreme climates naturally viewed the solstice as both an astronomical marker and a narrative one. The sun did not simply rise and fall. It seemed to grow weak, then grow strong again, like a living being. Far to the west, in the ancient Near East, midwinter rituals stretch back thousands of years, well before the rise of Rome. Archaeological layers from early Mesopotamian cities show evidence of seasonal feasts connected to periods of darkness, colder weather, and the symbolic renewal of light. Some reliefs depict torches, lamps, or fires arranged in ways that scholars interpret as ritual indicators of seasonal renewal. None of these are directly tied to later solstice myths, but they demonstrate a long-standing attention to the threshold between fading light and its return. The rituals varied from region to region, yet all share a similar awareness of winter as a period requiring both caution and ceremony. Egypt offers a different perspective, shaped by its own environment. While the Nile Valley did not endure winters as severe as those in northern latitudes, Egyptian religious texts still describe the sun as weakened during this season, sometimes imagined as slipping briefly into vulnerability. The winter solstice coincided with moments in Egyptian cosmology where the boundaries between disorder and order tightened, and temples occasionally mark this shift with controlled illumination or ritual fire. The Egyptian year was structured around cycles of flood, growth, and harvest, but the idea of a fragile sun at midwinter shows that even in milder climates, the seasonal shift carried symbolic weight. By the time we reach the Hellenistic period, the solstice had acquired a philosophical dimension. Greek astronomers observed the sun's arc with careful attention, charting its extremes and recognizing that these turning points framed the entire structure of the year. For them, the solstice was not merely a seasonal event, but part of the cosmic geometry that governed the world. Writers of the era describe the moment when the sun reaches its lowest point before beginning its upward journey as a kind of celestial reversal, a phenomenon both predictable and extraordinary. These interpretations filtered into broader Mediterranean thought, shaping how communities imagined the relationship between cosmos, time, and human life. All these traditions, Indo-Iranian, Near Eastern, Egyptian, Hellenistic, differ in detail, but they converge around a shared understanding. The winter solstice marks a moment when the world feels stretched toward its limit, only to begin again. That sense of renewal, grounded in physical observation rather than theology, formed a cultural substrate that many ancient peoples inherited without ever formalizing it. The solstice was a reminder that darkness was temporary, that light returned slowly, and that survival in winter required patience and trust in cycles that humans could not alter. It is in this world, already layered with meaning, that early Christianity began to grow. When 4th century Christian leaders later selected the 25th of December for the Nativity celebration, they were not choosing an empty date or inventing a new seasonal narrative. They were adopting a moment that had already been infused with symbolic weight for thousands of years. The association between midwinter and renewal was not uniquely Christian. It was part of a shared cultural grammar of the ancient world, one that made the idea of divine birth or returning light feel natural within the solstice season. Some scholars refer to this as a cultural resonance effect, where religious ideas take root more easily when they align with pre-existing symbolic structures. The solstice offered exactly such a structure, a moment of weakness followed by renewal, a time when light began its long return. Christianity didn't need to create that symbolism, it inherited it. And though early Christian texts rarely mention the season of Jesus' birth, later interpretations found in the solstice a ready-made stage for the story of a child born in darkness who would one day bring light. Understanding this backdrop does not diminish the distinctiveness of Christian belief. Rather, it places that belief within the continuum of human attention to seasonal change. The return of light is one of the few astronomical events noticeable even to those without instruments, and its meaning arises not from doctrine but from lived experience. In winter, ancient people gathered, watched the sky, and waited. They made meaning out of that waiting. Christianity, arriving in a world already shaped by such meaning, interpreted the solstice through its own internal language, absorbing the resonance without copying the rituals. And so the realization becomes clear. When Christianity eventually anchored its winter celebration to the solstice season, it was stepping into a long shadow cast by countless generations. The symbolism of returning light, of fragile beginnings, of renewal after darkness, was already deeply embedded in the cultures surrounding it. The solstice had become one of humanity's earliest shared metaphors, not because of any single tradition, but because of the universal experience of watching the sun weaken and return. But Christianity interpreted that light through its own internal language. What deepens this picture further is the way these solstice-infused ideas travelled along ancient routes long before Christianity emerged. We do not know for certain how far traders, herders, sailors, or seasonal migrants carried stories of the sun's yearly decline, but archaeological and linguistic patterns suggest that ideas tied to the solstice moved with people even when their languages or beliefs did not. Early Indo-European dispersals, for example, carried seasonal terminology across a vast territory that stretched from the Pontic steppe into South Asia and Western Europe. Certain reconstructed routes connected with light, glow, or renewal seem to appear in multiple daughter languages, not in identical form but in parallel structure, showing how deeply winter symbolism was woven into everyday speech. While these words do not prove a single mythic tradition, they show a shared sensitivity to the annual struggle between increasing darkness and the slow return of day. Material culture adds another layer. In several regions, objects linked to seasonal observance, lamps, portable fire altars, amuletic discs, or ceremonial vessels, appear in midwinter contexts across many centuries. Their purposes were varied, and it would be inaccurate to combine them into one unified system, but they collectively reveal a pattern. Midwinter was a time when communities drew attention to light as a resource to be protected, invoked, or symbolically restored. Some sites in the Levant and Anatolia show winter feasting deposits accompanied by hearths rebuilt at consistent moments in the year, while certain North African contexts preserve sequences of deposits timed to the period when the days were shortest. These finds tell us that winter was not simply endured but ritualized, marking a threshold that communities highlighted with intention. Ancient observation also shaped how political systems understood the solstice. In several cultures, rulers associated themselves with the turning of the year, emphasizing their role in stewarding cosmic order. Mesopotamian texts describe kings participating in seasonal rites that symbolically renewed their mandate, while inscriptions from the later Achaemenid and Parthian periods link rulership to cycles of stability and return. Even if these rituals were not explicitly tied to the solstice in every case, the winter season often acted as a stage upon which political authority was reaffirmed. People saw darkness deepen, resources tighten, and uncertainty grow, and leaders sought to align themselves with the moment when order pushed back against decline. This pattern extends into everyday life as well. In agricultural communities around the Mediterranean, midwinter did not bring the same existential threat as in northern climates, yet farmers still recognized the solstice as a marker separating the depleted fields of late winter from the coming period of gradual renewal. Early planting calculations, household preparation, and livestock management often timed their rhythms to the approximate solstice season, creating a practical layer of meaning beneath the ceremonial or philosophical ones. Light returning was not only symbolic, it signalled an approaching shift in labour and survival. All these strands, linguistic, material, ritual, political, practical, converged long before Christianity existed, forming a cultural landscape in which the solstice stood as a quiet but powerful constant. When Christianity began to articulate its own language of light, renewal, and birth, it did so within a world where the midwinter turning point already carried heavy significance. The solstice had furnished earlier societies with metaphors for vulnerability, struggle, and cyclical return. Christianity did not have to invent such metaphors. It inherited a terrain where they were already familiar, and from that terrain it began to reinterpret the returning light through its own internal language. You open the gospel narratives not as a believer or a skeptic, but the way an archaeologist would unroll a fragile papyrus, slowly, gently, attentive to what is present and what is missing. You read the nativity stories with the same quiet patience given to ancient inscriptions, noticing that the texts speak in the language of metaphor, prophecy, and literary pattern far more than in the language of weather, dates, or season. And you begin to sense that the earliest Christian writers were not trying to describe the climate of first-century Judea. They were trying to tell you something about meaning, about a kind of arrival that did not depend on the month of the year. The revelation follows naturally from this close reading. The earliest texts do not place Jesus' birth inside a specific season, because their purpose was not meteorology, but theology. They describe an event framed in symbols recognizable to Jewish audiences of the late Second Temple period, drawing on light imagery, prophetic motifs, and the narrative structures of sacred arrival rather than on historical dating. What emerges is not a chronicle of weather patterns, but a tapestry of literary signals crafted to convey the significance of the birth, not its timing. Some later interpreters propose literal dates, but the first communities seemed far more concerned with the meaning of the story than with the placement of the sun in the sky. The Gospel of Luke offers one of the clearest examples of this symbolic strategy. Scholars have long noted how Luke frames the nativity within a pattern of light emerging in darkness, a motif deeply rooted in Jewish prophetic literature. The opening chapters describe divine announcements appearing not in broad daylight but at night, accompanied by the radiance of heavenly messengers. This radiant language recalls older scriptural scenes in which light symbolizes revelation, guidance, or divine intervention. We do not know for certain whether Luke intended to evoke the imagery of dawn or solstice like renewal, but the textual structure leans toward the symbolic rather than the literal. It is not weather being described, but illumination, a literary device signaling the arrival of something transformative. This symbolic framing becomes even clearer when viewed through the lens of Jewish apocalyptic tradition. In the centuries around the birth of Christianity, Jewish texts often used the imagery of cosmic events to describe divine action. Light appeared when God acted. Darkness gathered when chaos threatened. Birth, in this tradition, was not simply a biological moment, but a metaphor for divine emergence. The nativity narratives of the Gospels fit naturally within this symbolic vocabulary. The details we now associate with a historical event, the night sky, the shepherds, the announcements, can also be read as literary patterns reflecting theological meaning. Some scholars argue that this framework aligns the Nativity with earlier birth narratives found in Second Temple literature, where figures destined for great purpose are introduced through symbolic signs rather than precise dates. Several Second Temple texts reinforce this literary model. Stories of significant births, whether of prophets, kings, or deliverers, often include symbolic elements, miraculous announcements, signs in the heavens, or narrative parallels to earlier scriptural figures. These elements function not as historical timestamps but as indicators of meaning, telling readers how to understand the child's identity. Luke and Matthew, writing within this shared cultural environment, appear to adopt similar narrative techniques. The presence of symbolic births in texts of the era suggests that the nativity stories were shaped less by seasonal observation and more by the long-standing tradition of using birth as a vehicle for conveying theological identity. This emphasis on meaning rather than timing becomes even more pronounced when we look at early Christian interpretations. Church writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries frequently treated the Nativity as a symbolic event. Some described it as the moment when divine illumination entered the world, not as a date on a calendar but as a transformation within history. Others linked the narrative to themes of incarnation, humility, or divine proximity. Very few early commentators attempted to place the birth in a specific month, and those who did often approached the question through symbolic reasoning rather than historical investigation. It was only later, when Christian communities sought firmer structures for their liturgical calendars, that precise dates began to take on greater importance. One example of this symbolic reading comes from Origen, a 3rd century theologian who questioned the very idea of celebrating a divine birth on a specific day, noting that Scripture does not provide one. His writings suggest that early Christians saw the Nativity less as a fixed historical event requiring commemoration, and more as a moment whose meaning unfolded spiritually, doctrinally, and poetically. Other early interpreters focused on metaphors of light appearing in darkness, echoing the imagery of John's prologue, where the arrival of the divine word is described as illumination for a world in shadow. These reflections highlight how the earliest Christian imagination approached the Nativity not through seasonal observation but through symbolic resonance. This symbolic framing does not diminish the possibility of a historical birth. Instead, it clarifies how early Christian writers chose to communicate its significance. They were not disinterested chroniclers measuring weeks and months, but storytellers working within a literary tradition that used imagery, prophecy, and metaphor to describe the intersection between the human and the divine. In this sense, the nativity narrative resembles other ancient accounts of sacred origins, where the central concern is not when the event occurred, but what it meant for the community that told the story. The absence of seasonal detail underscores this interpretive approach. Unlike agricultural calendars that anchor festivals to harvests, plantings, or astronomical events, the earliest Christian writings do not tie Jesus' birth to the solstice, the equinox, or any known seasonal marker. Even the shepherds in the fields, often cited as a seasonal clue, appear more as narrative figures invoked for theological contrast, humble witnesses to an extraordinary event, than as indicators of a specific month. Some modern scholars suggest that the description of shepherds at night belongs to the symbolic register, echoing themes of watchfulness and revelation rather than providing agricultural detail. Seen in this light, the nativity narratives behave more like a literary mosaic than a date-stamped record. They draw pieces from prophecy, liturgy, metaphor, and narrative tradition to create an account that communicates identity rather than chronology. And when later Christian leaders eventually selected December 25th as the date for the Nativity celebration, they were choosing a symbolic moment that resonated with the story's existing emphasis on light emerging in darkness. The solstice context, long meaningful across cultures, provided a fitting frame, not because the Gospel writers described winter weather, but because the story itself was already steeped in imagery of renewal, and so the realization emerges quietly. The earliest Christian writers were not trying to tell us when Jesus was born. They were trying to tell us what his birth meant. They placed symbols where we often look for dates, metaphors where we expect observations, and meaning where modern readers might search for meteorology. The Nativity was not framed as an event bound to a specific season, but as a moment whose significance transcended the calendar. Yet some early groups read these symbols in a more esoteric way. If we follow the narrative even more closely, we begin to notice how the nativity stories borrow the rhythms of older scriptural patterns, rather than the anchored details of chronological biography. The genealogies, for instance, function not as civic records but as theological architecture, shaping identity through lineage that connects Jesus to the long narrative of Israel. These genealogies, with their careful structuring and symbolic numbers, operate on a literary level designed to communicate continuity and fulfillment. They move the birth beyond the realm of seasonal detail and into the conceptual world of covenant, promise, and inherited meaning. Scholars often note that this structuring signals the intention of the authors to situate the child within a framework of divine history rather than within a Roman month or agricultural phase. This literary intentionality appears again in the way locations are used. Bethlehem, for example, is presented less as a pinpoint on a map and more as a site of theological resonance, echoing older prophetic expectations. The narrative significance lies not in whether the birth occurred at a particular latitude during a particular season, but in the way the location connects Jesus to earlier traditions of kingship and expectation. Some early Christian commentators, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, interpreted Bethlehem symbolically as well, describing it as the house of bread, a phrase they believed held layered theological meaning. Whether or not this was the original intention of the Gospel authors, it illustrates how early readers approached the Nativity as a story filled with symbolic geography rather than meteorological detail. Even the figures who surround the birth behave like actors in a symbolic drama. The wise men in Matthew's account, for instance, follow a star whose movement mirrors the celestial signs embedded in ancient narratives of significant births. We do not know for certain whether the star was intended as a literal astronomical event or as a literary device, but its behaviour aligns more closely with narrative symbolism than with known patterns of ancient skywatching. Stars in ancient literature often functioned as heralds of change, markers of destiny rather than empirical data. The Gospel's use of such imagery situates the nativity within this symbolic tradition, emphasizing its meaning rather than its date. It is instructive to observe how early Christians navigated the silence of the texts on seasonal timing. Instead of treating the absence as a problem, many embraced it as part of the story's significance. Silence itself became a kind of space for reflection, allowing communities to interpret the birth in ways that aligned with their spiritual and cultural environments. Some theologians of late antiquity even argued that the story's lack of a fixed date was intentional, inviting believers to see the birth as perpetually relevant rather than tied to a single moment in time. This interpretive openness offered room for diverse traditions and theological emphasis to develop long before the institutional church settled on December 25th. And it is here that we see why symbolism mattered. It allowed the nativity to function across cultures, histories, and differing climates. A story rooted in meteorology would have remained provincial. A story rooted in metaphor could travel. The symbolic registers used in the Gospels, light, revelation, spiritual birth, fulfillment, were flexible enough to take on new resonances as Christianity expanded into regions where winter meant something different, or nothing at all. The universality of the imagery ensured that the story's meaning endured even when the specific calendar date had not yet been chosen. This is why, when December 25th eventually entered Christian tradition in the 4th century of the Common Era, it fit within an existing symbolic framework rather than creating it. The solstice context did not impose meaning onto the story. It harmonized with what was already present. The gospel narratives have been written with an eye toward theological depth, not seasonal precision. The later choice of date simply aligned that symbolic depth with the ancient world's most resonant turning point of light. Yet some early groups read these symbols in a more esoteric way. Imagine for a moment that the story you think you know was never meant to be read on the surface. Picture a small group gathered in a dim room sometime in the 2nd century of the Common Era, far from the official meetings of more established Christian communities. There are no icons here, no formal creeds, no fixed dates marked on any calendar. Instead, they read slowly from worn manuscripts, passing the pages between them as if they were pieces of a fragile truth. One of those pages contains a question that does not appear anywhere in the public narratives. What if the birth of the divine child did not happen in a place at all, but happened within you? This was not a metaphor for them. It was a way of understanding spiritual life that reframed the entire story of beginnings. What if I told you that for some early Christian groups, the Nativity was not a moment to commemorate, but an event to undergo? The sources that describe this approach do not come from mainstream tradition. They come from writings discovered in the mid-20th century at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a collection of texts copied around the 4th century of the Common Era, but preserving ideas that were circulating far earlier. These texts provide a window into communities now called Gnostic, though the term itself hides a wide diversity of belief. They shared one conviction, that divine knowledge was an interior experience, and that the birth of the sacred did not begin in history, but in the quiet recesses of the self. They saw the Nativity not as a stable scene, but as a symbolic description of awakening, an emergence of insight from within ordinary human consciousness. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the clearest examples. Scholars note that it is a sayings collection, rather than a narrative, offering short teachings attributed to Jesus without any mention of birth, death, or resurrection. Among its lines is a passage that speaks of light hidden within a person, described not as something granted from outside, but as something already present and waiting to be recognized. Some scholars interpret these sayings cautiously, emphasizing that they do not describe a birth event at all, yet others note how the imagery echoes themes of emergence, self-discovery, and inner illumination. In this reading, the child is not a figure in a crib, but the spark of awareness one might encounter in moments of unexpected clarity. The Gospel of Philip, another text from the Nag Hammadi collection, goes further. It describes birth in explicitly symbolic language, often blending ritual with inward transformation. The text speaks of people being born again, not by returning to infancy, but by coming into understanding. According to a few scholars, these passages may reflect liturgical practices now lost to us, yet their emphasis is unmistakable. The true nativity is an interior event, a kind of emergence from ignorance into recognition. The language is dense, poetic, and often elusive, and it encourages a reading that focuses less on historical sequence and more on psychological movement. That does not mean these communities rejected the public narratives. It means they interpreted them as maps of the self rather than maps of the world. The Nag Hammadi texts frequently use metaphors of illumination. Light does not strike from above in these writings. It rises from within, described in terms that suggest a gradual clarifying of perception. One tractate compares the process to the dawn breaking inside the mind, an image that does not appear in canonical writings, but was meaningful to those who believed that divine presence was discovered through insight, rather than inherited through ritual. These metaphors are not presented as speculative philosophy. They reflect a lived spirituality that saw the body not as a barrier to truth, but as the very place where transformation occurred. Some early Christian mystics, though not formally part of Gnostic groups, used similar metaphors. Writers who lived in regions influenced by Hellenistic Judaism and early monastic thought described the human body as a kind of temple, a space in which divine presence might dwell. This idea appears in several strands of early Christian literature, but Gnostic groups developed it with particular intensity. If the body was a temple, then the birth of divine light could happen there. If the mind was a chamber, then understanding might arrive like a child emerging in the darkness. A few scholars propose that such imagery reflects a fusion of Jewish apocalyptic traditions with philosophical ideas drawn from the broader Mediterranean world, though the exact origins remain uncertain. There is another layer to this tradition that becomes clearer when we look at how these communities describe the process of becoming receptive to insight. Several Nag Hammadi texts speak of preparation, not as moral perfection, but as a kind of quieting of the inner noise that prevents recognition. This is not asceticism in the later monastic sense. It is more akin to attentiveness, a posture of mind that allows a person to perceive the small movements of awareness that would otherwise go unnoticed. In the language interpreting these texts requires caution. They do not represent all early Christians, and they often use language that is deliberately symbolic. Yet the evidence suggests that some communities internalize the nativity not as a historical detail, but as a psychological transformation. In their view, the external world's turning of seasons mirrored the inner world's turning toward awareness. Birth was not simply the entry of a child into the world. It was the moment insight first appeared in a person's life. That insight did not erase darkness, but it allowed one to see within it. This inward emphasis shaped their understanding of salvation. For these communities, the problem was not external oppression or cosmic conflict. The problem was ignorance, a lack of recognition of the inner light. Salvation was the moment a person realized that this light existed. Some scholars note that this differs sharply from the theological patterns that would later dominate Christianity. Yet within the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, such ideas circulated widely across Egypt, Syria, and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. They belonged to a world where religious interpretation was still fluid, and where symbolic readings of sacred stories were neither marginal nor discouraged. It is important to note that these interpretations did not reject the broader Christian tradition. Rather, they saw it through a different lens. Where mainstream communities emphasized the public life of Jesus, his birth, ministry, death, and resurrection, these groups focused on the interior landscape of the believer. They read the same stories but understood them as metaphors. The nativity was one such metaphor, a description of the moment when a person began to understand their place within a larger order of meaning. The child symbolized the earlier stage of that understanding, fragile and easily lost, yet essential for the path that followed. Some readers today might hear echoes of later mystical traditions in this approach. Scholars have compared the Gnostic emphasis on inner light with certain monastic writings of late antiquity, though the connections are debated. What seems clear is that for these early interpreters, symbolic language did not weaken the story, it deepened it. A birth that happened once in time could be remembered annually. A birth that happened inside a person could be renewed at any moment. It became a way of living, not a date to be observed. This inward orientation also shaped their approach to ritual. Some of the texts describe baptism, anointing, and other practices, but they frame these acts as symbolic enactments of internal change. The ritual did not cause the transformation, it acknowledged it. The divine child was already present, already growing, already pushing toward recognition. The ritual simply gave that awareness a visible shape. By studying these writings carefully, scholars can see how differently early Christians interpreted the same material. The canonical Gospels emphasize narrative. The Gnostic writings emphasize insight. The canonical tradition focuses on events. The Gnostic tradition focuses on experience. Both sought meaning, but they located it in different places. The nativity, in this view, becomes a bridge between two worlds, the world of public memory and the world of private understanding. For these early communities, the nativity was a metaphor for consciousness awakening. The divine child was not born once in a stable. The divine child was born whenever understanding dawned, and that to them was the real miracle. There is another layer to this tradition that becomes clearer when we look at how these communities describe the process of becoming receptive to insight. Several Nag Hammadi texts speak of preparation, not as moral perfection, but as a kind of quieting of the inner noise that prevents recognition. This is not asceticism in the later monastic sense. It is more akin to attentiveness, a posture of mind that allows a person to perceive the small movements of awareness that would otherwise go unnoticed. In the language of these manuscripts, ignorance is described as sleep, but not the peaceful kind. It is a state in which the world seems opaque, crowded with distractions and closed to deeper interpretation. Awakening is not sudden revelation. It is the slow recognition that something luminous has been present all along. Some early interpreters read these metaphors as a way of describing the role of knowledge within spiritual life. For them, knowledge was not information or doctrine, it was a mode of seeing. The birth of the divine child represented the first moment when this seeing became possible, when the self shifted into a new orientation toward the world. In a few passages from the Gospel of Philip, this change is described as an emergence from mixture into clarity, a movement from being tangled in conflicting impulses to possessing a unified sense of purpose. Scholars debate the precise meaning of these terms, yet the overall pattern is consistent. The nativity narrative was used as a model for the beginning of interior transformation. Newly aware communities often expressed this through language of discovery rather than invention. They did not claim to create light within themselves, they claimed to find it, and this distinction mattered. It positioned the divine not as something added to the human, but as something long obscured by ordinary experience. A few scholars have suggested that this emphasis parallels certain strands of Middle Platonic thought circulating in the Mediterranean during the 2nd century of the Common Era, though the texts themselves rarely name their sources. What matters is the way these communities articulated transformation, not as acquisition, but as unveiling. Another feature of these writings is the persistent use of relational language. The divine child is not described as a distant figure, but as a companion to the one who awakens. In the Gospel of Thomas, several sayings hint at the idea that recognizing the inner light restores a kind of kinship between the individual and the source of that light. This kinship is not presented as something inherited by birth or granted through ritual. It is realized gradually through the ongoing practice of attention. The metaphor of a child fits this process well. It suggests growth, fragility, and dependency, but also potential, perseverance, and the possibility of becoming something greater. In tracing this imagery across the surviving texts, scholars see a coherent pattern. The interior nativity functioned less as a theological claim and more as a guide for lived practice. These groups were not describing doctrines but experiences. The birth was the beginning of a journey, not its culmination. It marked the point at which a person could begin to differentiate between the noise of the outer world and the quiet signal of the inner one. And for them, that quiet signal mattered more than any calendar date, any ritual observance, or any external display of belief. The fragments we possess today remain incomplete, yet they reveal a world where symbolism carried practical meaning, where mythic language described psychological transformation, and where the nativity was not a historical memory but a personal threshold. In this interpretation, the divine child did not appear in a single year or a single place. The divine child appeared whenever a person recognized the presence of insight within their own life, and that recognition, once begun, could not easily be undone. But mainstream Christianity moved toward a different emphasis. Imagine a moment when stories that had once been whispered in small gatherings suddenly needed to stand in the open, where political winds, imperial calendars, and the expectations of strangers demanded clarity. In the earlier centuries of the Christian movement, the communities that followed the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth did not worry about dates or seasons. Their concerns were theological, ethical, and communal, not chronological. Yet as the movement expanded far beyond the intimate circles in which it began, the question of how to anchor that story in public time became unavoidable. What began as a narrative shaped by symbolism and inner interpretation was slowly drawn outward into the realm of shared festivals, civic record-keeping, and imperial communication. It is here, in the transition between private faith and public history, that the groundwork for a fixed birth date was laid. We do not know every detail, but the evidence suggests that by the 3rd century of the Common Era, Christian writers faced a widening debate. Some teachers, especially those influenced by allegorical traditions within Judaism and the Hellenistic world, insisted that scriptural stories were not meant to be literal records but moral and spiritual frameworks. Others, reacting to growing doctrinal disagreements, felt that too much symbolic interpretation risked dissolving the narrative into abstraction. The tension between these approaches appears in several early writings. Origen, writing in the early 3rd century, argued that the most significant truths were spiritual and should not be confined to physical events. Meanwhile, figures such as Hippolytus attempted to locate Jesus' life more firmly within Roman chronology, offering dates that placed key events in relation to known imperial reigns. This was not a matter of mere curiosity. It was a response to a growing need for coherence as communities spread across regions that did not share the same interpretive traditions. As Christianity extended across Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and further west toward the Roman heartland, its followers encountered a world where time itself was structured by imperial authority. The Roman Empire maintained multiple overlapping calendars, each carrying political meaning. The civic calendar displayed the emperor's power through public festivals. Astronomers maintained scientific calendars to track celestial patterns. Local communities layered their own agricultural and ritual timing on top of these systems. Within this environment, a movement without fixed dates or formal commemorations appeared unusual. The absence of a birth celebration for Jesus did not trouble the earliest followers, but it became increasingly problematic for a community now expected to take its place among the public cults of the empire. A date would eventually be needed, not only to clarify internal belief, but to make the tradition legible to the outside world. We can see the beginnings of this shift in 3rd century writings where Christian thinkers argued about the usefulness of literal history. Some authors favoured establishing a chronological biography of Jesus' life. Others warned that such anchoring risked obscuring the symbolic power of the narratives. Clement of Alexandria preserved references to various proposed dates, though his emphasis remained allegorical. The very existence of competing suggestions reveals an underlying concern. As new converts entered the movement, many sought concrete details to unify their practices. Without shared festivals, communities across the empire observed worship differently. This diversity was acceptable in a small network of gatherings, but once Christianity was numerous enough to require councils, envoys, and coordinated practice, inconsistency became increasingly difficult to manage. The 4th century of the Common Era transformed these debates. With imperial patronage expanding under Constantine and his successors, Christianity became part of the public fabric of Roman life. Imperial involvement did not dictate doctrine directly, but it encouraged the formation of clearer structures. Bishops needed to agree on core elements of faith. Liturgical practices had to be formalized so that Christians across the empire could share a common rhythm. A religion that had begun underground now stood in marketplaces, basilicas, and imperial courts. Dates mattered because shared dates produced shared experiences, and shared experiences helped forge a unified identity. At the same time, the empire itself was under pressure. Political instability, border conflicts, and economic fluctuations made coherent social institutions more valuable than ever. In this environment, religious festivals served a dual purpose. They reinforced belief and stabilized communities. Christianity, now prominent in many regions, faced the task of weaving its story into the larger rhythms of public life. A birth narrative that existed outside of time could persist in small gatherings, but it struggled to function as a unifying festival across a continent. Texts from the 4th century reflect these concerns. The need for a stable annual cycle of worship appears repeatedly in ecclesiastical writings. Councils discussed not only theological matters but practical ones, such as when to hold communal fasts or feasts. While the resurrection and its surrounding events were already tied to Passover and thus had a natural seasonal anchor, no such tradition existed for the nativity. The result was a gradual movement toward fixing a date, not to replace symbolism, but to accompany it. A minority of scholars note that some early interpreters still viewed the birth symbolically, but the wider trend leaned toward historical placement. This shift did not erase the older, more allegorical tradition. Rather, it created two layers of meaning that operated simultaneously. Publicly, the nativity became a festival that could draw communities together. Privately, many believers continued to read the story with theological nuance, seeing light imagery and symbolic motifs woven through the narratives. Yet the expanding structure of the institutional church required one element above all: coordination. A date offered that coordination. Even if the choice was shaped by complex cultural and political factors, it allowed communities in regions as distant as Gaul, Syria, and North Africa to participate in a shared observance. Attempts to anchor Jesus' life within Roman geography and imperial time intensified during this period. Church fathers wrote homilies connecting biblical events to known historical figures. Pilgrimage sites in the Eastern Mediterranean began to formalize, mapping sacred memory onto physical space. Scholars in Alexandria sought to correlate scriptural chronology with astronomical and historical references. The process was uneven, but its direction was consistent. Christianity was building a public history, one that could be communicated beyond the boundaries of private belief. Imperial patronage accelerated this development. When rulers endorsed Christianity, they encouraged the consolidation of doctrine to prevent fragmentation. A tradition with loose boundaries risked creating local variations that could become politically disruptive. Establishing clear festivals, including a birth date, helped stabilize the growing religious landscape. A fixed date also allowed Christian celebrations to be woven into the rhythm of state life, aligning with civic calendars and public events. It became a marker of presence, a sign that the movement now occupied a space once reserved for older cults and festivals. By the late 4th century, the 25th of December appeared in Christian liturgical documents, not as a theological necessity but as a practical solution. It created coherence where none had existed before. The symbolic meaning surrounding light and renewal remained, but they were now framed within a calendar that helped unify communities spread across vast distances. The transition from symbolic to historical emphasis did not represent the loss of mystery. Rather, it marked a moment when the movement adapted to the demands of a world in which visibility, coordination, and public identity had become essential. And so a date that had once been unnecessary slowly became central. It was not chosen because early followers believed Jesus had been born on that day, but because the maturing institution needed anchors, rhythms, and shared celebrations. A fixed birth date offered cohesion at a time when diversity, while spiritually rich, threatened to fracture the expanding movement. In that sense, the historical turn was less an attempt to confine meaning and more an effort to preserve continuity across a world that was changing rapidly. The world beyond Christianity also shaped that date. Yet there was another pressure, quieter but equally influential, that shaped the shift toward public history. The simple fact that written memory behaves differently from oral memory. Early Christian communities had relied on oral teaching, where fluidity and interpretation were expected. Stories could bend to context. A teacher could emphasize spiritual birth in one setting and ethical conduct in another without creating contradiction. But once Christian texts circulated more widely, the written word demanded firmer boundaries. The physical permanence of manuscripts encouraged questions that oral tradition could avoid. Readers wanted to know which events belonged where. They wanted to sequence miracles, sermons, and journeys. They wanted a biography. This subtle transformation of expectation is visible in how later scribes annotated their manuscripts. Marginal notes in certain 4th century codices indicate attempts to reconcile chronology between different Gospels, suggesting that readers increasingly sought harmonization. They were no longer satisfied with a symbolic geography of meaning. They wanted historical geography. And once history became important to readers, communal leaders felt compelled to respond. Fixing the birth date became part of answering a broader desire for temporal clarity within a growing literary culture. The rise of pilgrimage intensified this need. As Christians began visiting sites associated with Jesus' life, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, local traditions became powerful anchors of belief. Pilgrims wanted to know when certain events occurred. Bishops and local clergy, responsible for shaping liturgical life, responded by offering dates that could align ritual with place. The nativity, once a theological symbol, increasingly became associated with specific locations like Bethlehem. The more physical the tradition became, the more natural it seemed to assign it a position within the calendar. Another factor was the emergence of competing interpretations within the movement itself. As doctrinal disputes proliferated, some groups used symbolic readings of Jesus' life to justify theological positions that mainstream leaders considered destabilizing. Establishing a fixed chronology was one method of resisting these internal divergences. By presenting Jesus' life within a firm historical framework, church authorities could anchor doctrine in events rather than metaphors. It became a subtle tool of unity, a way to draw scattered interpretations into a single narrative arc. Even the administrative needs of the empire played a role. Provincial bishops required coordination for synods, fasts, and communal celebrations. A shared feast marking the birth of Jesus allowed communities from distant provinces to orient themselves toward the same seasonal reference point. The date functioned as a pivot around which other observances could be arranged. In this sense, December 25th was not imposed from above. It emerged from the practical requirements of an institution learning to operate across geography and culture. What makes this transformation striking is how gently it occurred. There was no single decree, no sudden mandate. Instead, it was a slow tightening of threads. As texts circulated, as pilgrim routes expanded, as imperial support encouraged structural cohesion, the symbolic became historical almost by necessity. The earliest Christians may not have needed a birth date, but the late antique world did. A tradition that began in private homes and secluded gatherings had grown into something that touched courts, cities, and entire provinces, and a story of inner illumination now needed a place in public time. The world beyond Christianity also shaped that date. A small group of people standing in the cold, long before written calendars existed, waiting for a sunrise that seemed for weeks to have drifted farther and farther south along the horizon. Picture them not as mystics or astronomers, but as careful watchers of a world where winter hunger and diminishing daylight were felt as intimately as breath. For most of the year, the movement of the sun was quiet, gradual, almost unnoticeable. But in the days around the solstice, something strange and delicate happened. The sun seemed to hesitate. Its rising point paused at the farthest edge it would ever reach, and then, just as slowly, it reversed direction. To people who depended on daylight for survival, this moment felt like a turning of the world itself. What if I told you that ancient observers did not need instruments or theories to perceive this return? All they needed was patience, memory, and a horizon they knew as well as their own skin. Archaeological and ethnographic studies suggest that across many regions, from the Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau to northern Africa, communities detected the shift of the solstitial sunrise with nothing more than repeated observation. The key was the daily comparison, where the sun rose yesterday and where it rose today. In winter, that shift was almost imperceptible, so slight that it required a continuity of watching, a chain of generational knowledge rather than a single person's effort. The earliest watchers likely did not think in terms of astronomical mechanics. They simply recognized that something which had been dwindling had begun quietly to return. We do not know the exact moment when this observation first gained symbolic weight, but written and oral traditions from widely separated cultures suggest that the solstice was seen as a threshold between defeat and renewal. In some Indo-European sources, the midwinter point was described metaphorically as a struggle between forces of darkness and light. Early Iranian texts, such as the Bundahishan, conceptualize seasonal turning points as cosmic contests, while Vedic materials describe the sun's annual journey in language that blends the physical and the divine. In both traditions, the period immediately after midwinter was associated with beginnings, strength returning from weakness, and a slow emergence out of decline. These sources are centuries apart in geography and composition, yet their broad thematic patterns converge around the same recognition. The sun's faint forward movement after its stillness was enough to inspire narratives of rebirth. In the ancient Near East, these motifs appeared even earlier. Textual remnants from regions like Babylon and Ugarit reference the midwinter period with imagery that scholars cautiously interpret as relating to the weakening and recovery of daylight. It is not always clear whether these images refer directly to the solstice or to broader seasonal transitions, but the recurrence of terms that denote fading, renewal, or cyclical return suggests that people long before the classical world were already attuned to the emotional and ecological weight of the darker season. Meanwhile, Egypt contributed its own vocabulary of renewal. Although Egyptian seasons did not map neatly onto European winters, texts referring to the weak sun or the sun's daily struggle through the underworld show how light could be imagined as vulnerable and in need of protection. Later Hellenistic writers absorbed these themes, interpreting celestial turning points not merely as astronomical markers, but as expressions of cosmic order. What mattered was the pattern, a cycle in which decline reached its limit and the world aligned itself toward growth again. By the time these ideas reached the Mediterranean of late antiquity, the solstice had become more than an astronomical moment. It was a cultural threshold recognized across multiple civilizations. In Greek texts, writers such as Geminus and Ptolemy describe the solstice with precision, noting the sun's halting point and its gradual return. Their language is technical, yet even within mathematical descriptions, there is an undercurrent of awe at the predictability of the cycle. Stoic and Neoplatonic philosophers, drawing on older traditions of cosmic harmony, treated the solstice as a restoring moment in the universe's breath-like rhythm. For them, turning points in the heavens echoed turning points in human life, offering analogies for renewal, recovery, and reordering. This broader intellectual environment shaped the world into which Christianity matured. By the 4th century of the Common Era, Christian communities lived in cities where solstitial symbolism was already part of the public imagination. Calendars used for civic life, agricultural scheduling, and imperial ritual all highlighted the solstice as a moment of change. Even without direct borrowing, early Christians would have been aware that the world around them paid attention to the days when light began to grow again. The association between increasing daylight and renewed strength was so widespread that linking Jesus' birth to this moment did not require an elaborate theological argument. It was simply an intuitive fit in a culture accustomed to understanding cosmic cycles as narratives of struggle, pause, and return. Yet the connection was not only cultural. At the practical level, ancient observers could verify the solstice's meaning with their own eyes. One didn't need mathematics or astrolabes to see that after a few days of apparent stillness, the sunrise began shifting back along the horizon. In some places, the change was marked against mountains or standing stones, while in others it was tracked informally by memory alone. This capacity for naked eye detection anchored solstice symbolism in lived experience. The moment light turned back was not an abstraction preached by authorities. It was a physical truth observable by anyone persistent enough to watch the sky each morning. When late antique thinkers described the solstice as the time when the sun was reborn, they were not indulging in poetry for its own sake. They were giving language to a visible phenomenon that marked the opening of a new arc in the year. Cross-cultural parallels reinforce this universality. In Chinese astronomical records, for example, the winter solstice was the point at which yang energy returned. Subtle, faint, but undeniably present. In several Mesopotamian sources, the midwinter period was framed as the moment when divine order reasserted itself over the chaos that accumulated during the darkest months. Scholars do not claim direct lines of influence between all these traditions, but the convergence of meaning is striking. Wherever the solstice was tracked, the language of return and renewal emerged. This deep background of interpretation meant that when Christian thinkers in the 4th century looked for a date to express the arrival of divine light into the world, the solstice offered a symbolic clarity that required no explanation. We cannot say with certainty that all Christian leaders consciously aligned Jesus' birth with the solar turning point. Surviving sources are fragmentary and often focus on theological concerns rather than calendrical reasoning. But what the evidence does show is that by the time December 25th appeared as the official date in Roman Christian communities, the solstice had already been understood for centuries as a hinge in the year, a moment when what had been receding turned back towards strength. The conceptual resonance between this natural cycle and the idea of divine arrival would have been difficult to ignore. A minority of scholars suggest that some early Christians may have interpreted the solstice as a sign that divine action followed cosmic order, but these proposals remain speculative. What we can say with confidence is that the symbolic logic of the solstice made the date feel appropriate within the intellectual climate of late antiquity. It provided a natural frame for understanding a narrative centered on renewal, hope, and the promise that change could begin even in the deepest darkness. By the 4th century, then, the connection between Jesus' birth and the solstice was neither arbitrary nor purely doctrinal. It rested on a long-standing human recognition of the moment when the sun turned back, offering the first faint sign that the trajectory of decline had reversed. For a world shaped by scarcity, cold, and uncertainty, this turning was more than astronomical. It was psychological reassurance and cultural continuity, a reminder that cycles of difficulty were not final. In such a context, celebrating birth at this hinge of light felt not imposed but almost inevitable. And as Christianity continued to grow, some groups took that symbolism even further, treating the solstice not only as an outer sign but as a metaphor for inner change. But some communities pressed the symbolism further inward. A person sitting alone in a stone cell in the desert, the cold sand of a winter night pressing against its walls, the silence so complete that breathing becomes the only movement left in the world. In that stillness, long before Christmas became a festival of streets and candles and shared hymns, some of the earliest Christian ascetics claimed that the true birth of light happened in precisely such a moment, not outside them, but in the narrow space where attention met its own darkness. They spoke of finding something small, something easily missed, something that did not arrive with trumpets or stars. They described it as a spark that revealed itself only when a person stopped looking outward and allowed the night inside to settle. The solstice, to them, was less an astronomical event than a condition of the mind, a place where every person carried a season of their own. The revelation that survives in their writings is quiet but unmistakable. In the letters, homilies, and sayings of the desert fathers of Egypt, written in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the language of inner light appears again and again. We do not know for certain whether the metaphors emerged directly from seasonal cycles. but the evidence suggests that the ascetic imagination consistently treated darkness as a proving ground and illumination as an inward birth. Some early writers described the mind as a cave, a chamber hollowed by discipline and silence, where a subtle light would eventually dawn. Others spoke of the heart as a closed room whose lamp had long been extinguished, waiting for the return of a flame that no earthly fire could imitate. The desert itself provided the language. Its nights were long, its stillness unforgiving, its shadows profound. In that setting, spiritual experience often took the shape of a winter that needed to be endured before any warmth could return. The information we hold today points to several strands of this early imagery. One comes from the collections known as the Apophthegmata Patrum, where the Desert Fathers repeatedly use metaphors of illumination to describe self-knowledge. They speak of purity of heart as a light that grows, of contemplation as a rising dawn, and of the disciplined mind as a window through which something brighter can be seen. Another strand originates in Syriac Christian literature from roughly the same era. Writers such as Ephrem the Syrian make use of imagery that blends physical and spiritual radiance, referring to enlightenment as a warming of the inner person, and describing wisdom as a beam that finds its way through the cracks of sorrow or confusion. Still another source comes from Evagrius Ponticus, whose surviving works offer some of the earliest psychological reflections in Christian monasticism. He writes of the mind possessing its own luminosity, obscured not by the world but by restless thoughts. In his teaching, the work of prayer is a gradual clearing of this inner sky until its natural brightness becomes visible. Archaeologists cannot recover the inner experiences of these individuals, yet manuscript studies allow us to observe how consistently they frame their efforts in terms of light emerging from interior darkness. The heart appears in their writings as a chamber, sometimes described as narrow, sometimes as hidden, and sometimes as a kind of cave. This metaphor didn't imply emptiness, but depth. The early ascetics believed that entering this chamber required both courage and stability, since the mind, once turned inward, encountered not peace, but the full weight of its own unrest. Only by remaining still within that darkness, the way one waits for the first shift of the solstice dawn, could something transform. Some interpreters propose that this structure reflects an unspoken continuity with older winter solstice symbolism, where the longest night marks the hidden beginning of light rather than the end of it. Although the connection cannot be confirmed, the thematic parallels are striking. The realization that emerges from these texts is that for the early ascetics, spiritual rebirth was not a public event. It was not marked by a date, a gathering, or a ritual performed by others. It was imagined as a process taking place in hiddenness, traced in the slow change of a person's habits, or the quiet clearing of their thoughts. In this worldview, the birth of the divine child, a symbol used by some writers to describe transformation, did not occur in a stable, but in the depth of the human person. A minority of scholars suggest that the language of these communities may have drawn unconsciously from broader solstice imagery, circulating in late antiquity. The idea that the smallest, weakest light emerges precisely when the night is longest. Whether or not the influence was direct, the resonance remains. The solstice was a lived psychological moment before it became a festival, a turning point felt inside long before it was celebrated outside. If we follow their writings further, a second theme becomes visible beneath the language of interior light, the insistence that illumination rarely arrived suddenly. Modern readers often imagine revelation as a single moment, a flash, a breakthrough, a sudden lifting of the veil. But the manuscripts of early monastic life repeatedly describe something else. They speak of light that strengthens by degrees, the way sunrise gathers along a distant ridge, first as a suggestion, then as a presence, and only much later as a form that can be named. Some desert fathers compared spiritual understanding to the way dawn moves through the narrow openings of a cave, slowly, unevenly, often unnoticed until enough brightness has accumulated to change the room. A few Syriac writers go even further, explaining that insight deepens only when a person remains faithful during long periods of inward obscurity. They saw this not as failure, but as the necessary shape of growth. A minority of scholars suggest that such metaphors reflect the psychological rhythms of solitude, where the mind adapts gradually to its own landscape, gaining stability long before it gains clarity. There are also traces of a different kind of imagery, one exploring the difficult terrain a person must cross before the first gleam of inner illumination appears. Evagrius Ponticus describes this terrain as a wilderness of thoughts, shifting and unpredictable. To him, a person entering their own heart is not stepping into peace, but into a place that must be cleared. His writings point to a long and steady labour, less like receiving light than cultivating a space where light can eventually settle. In this sense, the ascetics did not treat enlightenment as an event bestowed from beyond, but as a condition revealed through persistence. And although they used the language of brightness, they never divorced it from discipline. Light, in their view, did not free a person from the difficulty of the inner landscape. It made that landscape navigable. Some early monastic authors also describe episodes of intense interior dimness, moments when the inner chamber felt sealed and unresponsive. They accepted these intervals not as signs of abandonment, but as part of the rhythm of spiritual formation. One Syriac homily compares this darkness to the longest night of winter, explaining that the turning point cannot be detected while it is happening. Only later, looking back, does one realize that a change in direction has already begun. It is not certain whether this metaphor was intended as a direct reference to the solstice, yet the parallel is clear enough to suggest at least a conceptual kinship. Just as the returning sun cannot be seen at first, the first stages of interior renewal are almost always imperceptible. This emphasis on gradual transformation shaped the collective imagination of early ascetic communities. They understood that the light they sought could not be forced, hurried, or summoned. It emerged when the inner landscape became quiet enough for its presence to be felt, and in that slow dawning, the solstice gained new meaning, not as a date on the calendar, but as a mirror for the inward return of clarity. Still, the outer celebration took its own form. Imagine a moment when a date, once nothing more than a local calculation on an imperial calendar, begins to seep outward like a drop of ink touching water. It is quiet at first, barely noticed beyond the clerics and record keepers of a single city. But slowly, as if guided by a rhythm older than paper or parchment, it spreads through letters, sermons, and the steady movement of people who carry their festivals in memory. Picture a world where communities still struggle to speak a common theological language, where winter tightened around the Mediterranean in uneven ways, and where the meaning of a season could shift simply by crossing a border. Into this mosaic of customs and calendars came the idea that the 25th of December should mark a birth, not because every believer agreed on the details, but because the expanding church needed a shared point on the map of time. It is not certain who first proposed this date, but the evidence suggests that by the 4th century of the Common Era, prominent bishops and theologians in Rome and North Africa were already framing it as a marker of theological significance. Writings attributed to Hippolytus, debates preserved by early commentators, and later reflections in the works of Augustine hint at communities wrestling with the tension between symbolism and precision. Yet what stands out most is the absence of earlier interest. For the better part of 2 centuries, Christians debated many things, but the date of Jesus' birth was not among them. The focus lay elsewhere, on teachings, on resurrection, on ethical life, on surviving within a complicated empire. Only once Christianity stepped into a more public role did dates begin to matter in a new way. From Rome, the idea moved outward with surprising speed. Letters travelled with merchants, bishops visited other sees, and the newly formalised communication networks of the Church carried both doctrine and custom. By the later decades of the 4th century, the 25th appears in liturgical references in Gaul, Spain, and parts of North Africa. Churches that had once kept different calendars began to align their winter observances to this Roman rhythm. Some did so eagerly, seeing the date as a powerful symbol of divine presence at the turning of the year. Others accepted it gradually, blending it with regional customs that gave winter its own flavour. In Egypt, for instance, older traditions lingered even as the Roman date took hold. In Syria, theological debates shaped adoption more slowly. Yet across these differences the movement continued. As the date spread, it altered the landscape of worship. Liturgy began to crystallise around it. Hymns, prayers, and readings were assigned to the day, anchoring the story of a birth not just in doctrine, but in the emotional fabric of communal life. Calendars that had once been shaped primarily by local agricultural rhythms or civic festivals now contained a midwinter moment tied to a narrative of hope. In some places, the festival layered itself atop older seasonal gatherings. In others, it introduced a new period of reflection into communities already familiar with winter renewal. The details varied, but the effect was similar. The 25th became a hinge of the year. We do not know for certain how ordinary people understood this shift, but traces remain. Fragments of sermons suggest communities negotiating meaning, asking whether the date was symbolic or historical, or whether such distinctions mattered at all. Administrative documents hint at civic events reorganised around it. Archaeological remains, such as decorated meeting spaces and early Christian household objects, show a growing desire to mark the season with shared imagery. A date that had once been confined to a small circle of scholars became a seasonal anchor for farmers, soldiers, artisans, and children, and as it became more widely observed, it began to feel inevitable, even though its roots were recent. In many ways, this adoption reflects a simple truth. Expanding movements require shared moments. A fixed birth date offered coherence across vast regions divided by language, custom, and interpretation. It allowed communities separated by mountains, deserts, and seas to participate in the same story at the same time. It gave families and congregations a rhythm that could be repeated year after year, binding memory into practice. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a way for belief to be lived collectively, not only privately. The date provided a structure even for those who approached it symbolically rather than literally, allowing metaphor and devotion to coexist under the same winter light. Yet beneath this growing tradition ran a deeper current, one far older than any liturgical document. The very reason the date resonated so widely was because it arrived in a world where midwinter already held meaning. Long before edicts, hymns, or theological arguments, people across the Mediterranean and Near East had treated the solstice as a moment of renewal. The official adoption of December 25th did not erase that older inheritance. Instead, it settled gently atop it, shaped by it, and in many ways strengthened by it. The Church may have provided the celebration with a new narrative, but the landscape, cultural and astronomical, had prepared the ground long before. And this is why the transformation from local festival to global tradition feels less like an imposition and more like a continuation. A symbol became a tradition because it aligned with patterns already felt by countless communities: the thinning light, the long night, the promise of return. These were not doctrines but experiences, and when Christianity wove its story into those cycles, it tapped into something shared and ancient. The date spread not by force but by recognition, the sense that a birth celebrated in winter echoed truths the world already knew. For if December 25th had been arbitrary, it would have faded. Instead, it became a hinge for centuries of life, thought, and ritual. Not because it solved debates or offered certainty, but because it provided a meeting place between the outer world and the inner one, a shared day in a fractured world where light was turning back slowly, faithfully, across every horizon of the ancient Mediterranean. As the festival grew in scope, its meaning also adapted to the lived reality of different Christian regions. In the western provinces of the empire, winter had a harsher presence than in Rome or Alexandria. Long nights confined people indoors, and agricultural stillness slowed the tempo of life. This seasonal pause created a natural setting for communal gatherings, and evidence from homilies in Gaul and northern Italy shows that bishops often framed the new midwinter celebration around themes of social solidarity. One sermon preserved in a 5th century manuscript from Turin speaks directly to a congregation anxious about famine, cold, and uncertainty, urging them to see the winter birth as a reminder that endurance creates its own renewal. It is a detail that rarely appears in theological debates, but it reveals how the date's power came not only from ecclesiastical authority, but from its ability to meet communities where they already lived in their yearly rhythms of hardship and rest. In North Africa, the picture was different. Winter there carried more variation, shaped by regional climates and the agricultural calendars tied to them. Correspondence from bishops in Carthage and Hippo suggests that some communities adopted December 25th more slowly, often alongside pre-existing local observances that had their own seasonal focus. Here, the festival's growth seems to have depended more on educational networks. Catechetical schools, where new converts studied scripture and debated doctrine, became places where the symbolic significance of the birth narrative was taught alongside its historical framing. When these new Christians returned to their towns, they carried with them not only a date, but a taught understanding of why it mattered. It is likely that this educational infrastructure played a crucial role in normalizing December 25th throughout the region. As the festival grew in scope, its meaning also adapted to the lived reality of different Christian regions. In the western provinces of the empire, winter had a harsher presence than in Rome or Alexandria. Long nights confined people indoors, and agricultural stillness slowed the tempo of life. This seasonal pause created a natural setting for communal gatherings, and evidence from homilies in Gaul and northern Italy shows that bishops often framed the new midwinter celebration around themes of social solidarity. One sermon preserved in a 5th century manuscript from Turin speaks directly to a congregation anxious about famine, cold, and uncertainty, urging them to see the winter birth as a reminder that endurance creates its own renewal. It is a detail that rarely appears in theological debates, but it reveals how the date's power came not only from ecclesiastical authority, but from its ability to meet communities where they already lived, in their yearly rhythms of hardship and rest. In North Africa, the picture was different. Winter there carried more variation, shaped by regional climates and the agricultural calendars tied to them. Correspondence from bishops in Carthage and Hippo suggests that some communities adopted December 25th more slowly, often alongside pre-existing local observances that had their own seasonal focus. Here, the festival's growth seems to have depended more on educational networks. catechetical schools where new converts studied scripture and debated doctrine became places where the symbolic significance of the birth narrative was taught alongside its historical framing. When these new Christians returned to their towns, they carried with them not only a date, but a taught understanding of why it mattered. It is likely that this educational infrastructure played a crucial role in normalizing December 25th throughout the region. Picture a moment when the deepest winter night had no accompanying doctrine, no fixed calendar, and no story bound to a single birthplace. Imagine a world where the longest darkness was met not with theology, but with instinct, where people gathered simply because the cold demanded it, and the sky offered one shared signal. The sun had reached its farthest point and would now begin its slow return. It is in this quieter world that the oldest midwinter gatherings emerged, shaped not by any one culture, but by the elemental pressures of survival. And if Christmas feels familiar across so many regions, even those untouched by early Christianity, it may be because the festival inherited echoes of far older responses to winter, responses tied to hunger, hope, warmth, and the fragile return of light. We do not know for certain how much of Rome's winter life remained intact after the 4th century of the Common Era, but surviving texts and inscriptions allow us to trace at least the silhouette of older festivals. The late Roman Saturnalia, often simplified in modern imagination, was a more complex ritual season stretching across several days, marked by structured gift-giving, role inversions, and public feasts that emerge from the agricultural calendar rather than religious doctrine. Administrative documents and letters from the late imperial period reveal that markets, guilds, and private households synchronized their winter gatherings around these communal days, creating a rhythm of social warmth at a time when daylight was at its weakest. Archaeological finds from household shrines in the Bay of Naples region show miniature figurines, greenery, and lamps arranged together in midwinter contexts, hinting at the way fires and evergreen branches served as small domestic anchors against the darkness. Far to the north, entirely independent traditions reveal similar instincts. Northern European midwinter customs, preserved partially through medieval manuscripts and partially through archaeology, show that communities treated the solstice as a threshold moment. Excavations in southern Scandinavia have uncovered winter feasting sites, with animal bones, charred timber, and remnants of drinking vessels clustered around central hearths. Later, textual sources from the early medieval period refer to Jul, a midwinter season marked by communal meals and rituals of remembrance. Linguists note that the word's earliest meanings likely revolved around cyclical turning points, not deities. What emerges is a picture of communities who used fire, food, and evergreen plants to signal resilience in the face of the long polar night. It is not that these customs fed directly into Christian practice. Rather, they reveal the enduring human response to winter's pressures. Moving eastward, Iranian Yalda traditions provide another window into ancient solstice thought. The word Yalda itself, appearing in Syriac Christian texts before entering Persian usage, referred to birth. By late antiquity, Iranian communities gathered on the longest night to honour the arrival of light, drawing from Zoroastrian cosmology, in which cosmic order struggled continually against darkness. Later, Persian poetry, especially in the works of Hafez, preserved symbolic associations between night, brightness, and rebirth that likely draw on older ritual structures. Scholars who trace these traditions through linguistic and textual layers argue that Yalda reflects an archetypal human response to the winter solstice, rather than a direct line of influence to Christianity. Yet the parallels are instructive. Warmth, storytelling, shared food, and the conviction that a turning point in the sky mirrored a turning point in human life. Even farther south, Egyptian evidence contributes another layer to this shared pattern. Temple inscriptions from Philae, as well as Greco-Roman period commentaries on Egyptian religion, describe the weak sun of winter as a fragile childlike force needing renewal. Some early texts, including interpretations of the rise of Sirius and the solar cycles, frame the sun's seasonal changes as a repeating sequence of depletion and rebirth. Although these rituals centered on local deities and seasonal flooding rather than solstice astronomy, they nonetheless show how winter's thinning light inspired narrative frameworks long before the rise of Christianity. Egyptian imagery of the infant sun, often placed in a lotus or emerging between protective forms, reflects a symbolic language that resonates with the broader Mediterranean world's fascination with returning brightness. Hellenistic interpretations add yet another layer to this picture. Philosophers writing between the 3rd and 1st centuries before the Common Era developed increasingly abstract ways of describing cosmic turning points. Texts from Stoic and Middle Platonic thinkers refer to the solstice as a moment of cosmic realignment, a pivot between decline and ascent. These interpretations were not attached to ritual celebrations so much as they were to intellectual frameworks for understanding the universe, but they helped shape the cultural environment of late antiquity. By the time Christianity was spreading across the Mediterranean, these philosophical ideas provided a vocabulary that made it easy to speak of the birth of light as both a celestial phenomenon and a metaphor for renewal. When we gather these threads together, what emerges is not a single ancestral festival, but a constellation of seasonal responses. Feasting, fires, evergreen imagery, and communal gatherings appear in archaeological layers and textual traditions from regions far distant from one another. These practices didn't converge because cultures borrowed from a single source. Rather, they echo each other because winter created parallel pressures on human life. Midwinter demanded warmth, food reserves, and emotional solidarity. Fires symbolized endurance when daylight was scarce. Evergreens offered visual proof that something lived through the dark season. Shared meals provided community at a time when isolation carried real danger. Across the ancient world, the solstice became a moment for acknowledging vulnerability and invoking resilience. This is why Christmas feels familiar even in places whose oldest layers predate Christian theology. The festival did not erase earlier practices. Instead, it arrived in a landscape already shaped by winter's psychological and practical demands. People were already accustomed to marking the turning of the year with light, food, community, and symbolic gestures. When Christianity formalized a midwinter celebration, it entered a world where such gestures felt not foreign, but intuitively recognizable. Some early Christian writers acknowledged these parallels with caution, noting that shared practices did not imply shared beliefs. And modern scholars emphasize that continuity does not necessarily mean direct inheritance. Yet the patterns remain. Fires, greenery, communal gatherings, and turning point narratives belong to the long human experience of winter as much as they do to any particular religious system. It is possible, though not certain, that these parallels helped ease Christianity's spread of December 25th. The date carried symbolic weight, because the season already carried symbolic weight. Communities did not need to be instructed that winter's turning point mattered. They felt it in their bodies, in their food stores, in the way their animals behaved, and in the way the sun hovered low on the horizon. The solstice offered a shared emotional grammar that Christianity could speak into, reinterpret, and eventually reshape. And so Christmas became a festival that resonates in places where Christian theology is neither dominant nor historically foundational. its imagery of light returning, of warmth in the cold, of renewal emerging from the darkest moment, rests on instincts older than any one text or tradition. The echoes of Saturnalia, of Yalda, of northern feasting halls, of Egyptian temple rites, and of Hellenistic philosophy are not evidence of a single lineage, but of a shared human response to the rhythms of the earth. Christianity absorbed these echoes not by design, but by entering a world where humans had already learned to meet winter with symbols of life. If we look closely at how these older festivals operated on the ground, another pattern emerges. Winter did not just inspire hope through light. It pressed communities to renegotiate social bonds. Feasting, for example, was rarely just about celebration. Archaeologists examining waste deposits at Iron Age settlements in northern Britain note that midwinter feasts often relied on animals slaughtered specifically at the coldest time of year, when fodder grew scarce and herds needed thinning. The resulting gatherings were as much about ecological necessity as ritual. Yet the communal sharing of meat transformed scarcity into solidarity, creating a kind of seasonal generosity that shaped cultural memory long after its original economic logic faded. Early Christian communities, entering regions where such feasts were still vital, often layered their own celebrations onto these existing moments of exchange. We cannot confirm direct influence, but the alignment of social rhythms made the adoption of a winter festival feel more natural than forced. In the Eastern Mediterranean, papyri from Greco-Roman Egypt reveal another dimension of midwinter life: the administrative calendar itself. Tax documents and village records show that many rural communities synchronize their year not by religious feasts, but by agricultural cycles and planetary markers. Some contracts refer to the turn of the sun as a convenient shorthand for midwinter, suggesting that the solstice served as a widely understood chronological anchor, even in non-ritual contexts. When Christianity later established a fixed feast during this period, it entered a calendrical environment where people already experienced this season as a hinge in both nature and administration. Farther north and west, Celtic-speaking communities of the late Iron Age left material traces that suggest a nuanced engagement with winter's symbolism. Excavations at ritual enclosures in Ireland reveal deposits of charred hazelnuts, animal bones, and intentionally broken ceramics dating to midwinter horizons. These deposits appear to mark moments of communal offering rather than feasting alone. Medieval Irish texts, though much later, preserve memory of winter gatherings associated with sovereignty rights and renewal of tribal bonds. Scholars caution against projecting these sources too far into prehistory, yet the consistency of winter as a time for communal reaffirmation is striking. The ritual language of renewal, embedded in narrative cycles like the Ectre tales, helps us understand why later Christian celebrations could feel at home in regions with long-standing symbolic associations tied to the solstice. In the Levant, another layer of evidence appears in the form of seasonal pilgrimages. Inscriptions from Nabatean and early Arab contexts reference rituals linked to the turning of the year, often involving lamps, torches, or offerings made near natural high places. Though these practices were not tied to the solstice with precision, their placement in the darkest part of the seasonal cycle indicates that light symbolism carried emotional weight in a landscape where longer nights affected travel, trade, and pastoral life. These traditions add further texture to the broader environment into which Christianity eventually expanded, a world in which the concept of light returning after darkness carried meaning across languages and landscapes, even without shared cosmologies. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, relief carvings from late Hittite and Phrygian sites depict seasonal cycles through imagery of deities holding budding branches or standing beside torches. Some scholars interpret these as representations of winter rites tied to agricultural scheduling. Others propose that the imagery reflects a symbolic negotiation between death and renewal embedded in the regional imagination. Regardless of the precise interpretation, it is clear that the season between late autumn and early spring held layers of significance far deeper than any single festival could express. Christianity's winter feast, when placed in this mosaic, stands less as a transplant and more as a reinterpretation. The echoes of pre-Christian winter traditions can even be traced through linguistic patterns. In several Indo-European languages, words associated with brightness, dawn, or renewal cluster around roots that originally referred to cycles or turning points. These linguistic structures are not direct evidence of ritual, but they show how deeply the idea of seasonal change shaped thought. When early Christian writers described the birth of Christ as the arrival of light in darkness, they were using a vocabulary already resonant in many of the regions they addressed. It is not certain that this resonance influenced conversion or doctrinal development, but the familiarity of the imagery would have softened the conceptual leap from older seasonal customs to a new theological narrative. Yet these parallels never imply a simple continuity. This was not a world in which Christianity swallowed older practices whole, or in which every symbol merged naturally into its new context. Instead, Christianity encountered a landscape filled with subtle seasonal habits, ritual gestures, and shared understandings of winter's emotional weight. Some aligned naturally with the new festival, others remained independent. What mattered is that the human experience of winter had already shaped the emotional and symbolic terrain. When Christianity offered a story of birth, renewal, and light at the year's turning point, it was speaking into a long-established dialogue between people and the sky. But Christianity reshaped these echoes through its own internal meaning. Imagine a world in which the coldest weeks of the year offered almost no reassurance that spring would return. Picture the final stretch of winter in the late antique Mediterranean, when food stores thinned, tempers shortened, and ordinary people quietly measured their hopes against the dwindling warmth of the sun. In that world, a story about an infant arriving at midwinter carried a different emotional weight. It didn't speak only of a historical moment or a family in Judea. It spoke to a deeper pattern, one familiar across many cultures long before Christianity took its final shape. The idea that renewal enters the world quietly, tentatively, and in a form small enough to be cradled. The earliest Christian communities may not have shared a single birth date, but they did share a landscape where the metaphor of infancy carried its own unmistakable meaning. What if I told you that this emphasis on the newborn did not emerge from later piety alone, but from theological reasoning at the heart of early Christian identity? The concept of incarnation became central in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, when theologians sought to explain how the divine could enter human experience without overwhelming it. We do not know for certain how widespread this emphasis was in ordinary congregations, but surviving writings from figures such as Ignatius of Antioch and Irenaeus of Lyons show a consistent pattern. The divine becomes meaningful precisely by entering frailty. The miracle was not strength, it was vulnerability. And that vulnerability shaped the narrative surrounding Jesus' earliest moments long before church calendars fixed a date upon them. Scholars note that by the late antique period, the symbolic value of infancy was unusually charged. Medical texts from the first centuries of the Common Era describe the early days of life as the narrowest passage between existence and loss. In that same period, Greco-Roman and Jewish writings use the newborn as an emblem of hope, purity, and both literal and symbolic beginning. When the Gospel of Luke presents an infant wrapped and placed where animals fed, it is not describing meteorology or precise chronology. It is composing a scene in which fragility becomes the vessel for meaning. The language of light used in the same narrative appears in tandem with this emphasis, suggesting that the arrival of a child conveyed not only a theological point, but also a subtle statement about renewal itself. As some early commentators understood it, the nativity functioned as a literary answer to a world that often seemed directionless. Allegorical homilies from the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era frame the birth story as a hinge between darkness and growth. It is not certain how widespread this interpretation was, but a few sources imply that listeners were encouraged to imagine themselves standing at a threshold. In that threshold, the child was less a historical figure than a symbol of a world resetting its course. When church teachers described Jesus as an infant, they were not limiting him. They were situating him within a universal pattern visible in natural cycles, agricultural rhythms, and even philosophical discussions of renewal found among Stoic and Neoplatonic writers. Across the Mediterranean basin, many cultures had long used the image of a child to describe the first stirring of a light or fortune after hardship. Egyptian texts speak of a newborn sun at the height of winter, a phrase not meant to describe literal infancy, but to capture the feeling of beginnings. Some Indo-Iranian sources use metaphors of infant fire to describe the first flames drawn from ritual hearths during seasonal ceremonies, and in Hellenistic Jewish literature from the centuries before and after the turn of the era, light often takes the form of a rising presence, small at first but gaining strength in accordance with divine favour. Christianity did not copy these metaphors, but it entered a landscape already prepared to hear the symbol of a child as the perfect expression of renewal. The link between vulnerability and divine agency created an unusual narrative balance. Early Christian writers wanted to emphasize both human limitation and cosmic purpose, and the figure of an infant allowed both themes to coexist naturally. A child cannot defend itself, cannot assert, cannot command. And yet within the symbolic reading of the Gospels, this child carried the possibility of transformation. Some early interpreters understood this as a demonstration that the divine works through what appears insignificant. Others read it as a philosophical inversion of the ancient world's obsession with power. In either case, the child symbolized a beginning more than an arrival, a promise rather than an accomplishment. As late antiquity advanced, this metaphor of infancy aligned increasingly with broader cultural readiness for narratives of renewal. The Roman Empire had endured centuries of upheaval, and by the 4th century of the Common Era, many communities longed for a story that affirmed new beginnings, rather than endless cycles of crisis. In that climate, the Nativity offered more than theology. It offered a psychological structure that people could return to each winter. The solstice marked the moment when observable daylight slowly returned. The birth narrative offered the complementary idea that meaning also returns, but tentatively, carefully, and often through what appears powerless. This convergence was not accidental. It was the product of a world that saw in the smallest spark a reason to endure the cold. It is not possible to know how individual Christians in Roman cities or rural villages experienced this symbolism, but scattered writings hint that the Nativity was often understood as a moment to reframe the year, to let go of the previous cycle's burdens, and to imagine new possibilities. The child represented hope not because of what he would become, but because of what he had not yet done. In that sense, the story spoke to the simplest human truth. Beginnings matter precisely because they are fragile, and yet some sources describe deeper layers hidden beneath this image. If we look closely at the textual landscape of late antiquity, another layer of meaning becomes visible beneath the familiar nativity scenes. Several early homilies and commentaries, often overlooked because they survive only in fragmentary form, describe infancy as a spiritual posture rather than a chronological state. It is not certain how widespread these reflections were, but a few authors speak of becoming small in spirit as a prerequisite for receiving insight. This language appears in Syriac Christian writings from the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, where humility is framed as a kind of inner clearing, a space in which understanding can take root. In that sense, the nativity child is not only a symbol of renewal in the world, but also an invitation to cultivate stillness within oneself. The metaphor works because it matches lived human experience. New beginnings rarely arrive fully formed, and transformation usually starts in quiet, uncertain ways. Some early communities appear to have connected this imagery to the broader pattern of seasonal renewal without making the link explicit. For example, in a few late antique monastic texts, the arrival of spiritual clarity is described with phrases such as the dawn within the heart or morning rising in the mind. These metaphors likely reflect daily rhythms of prayer, but they also hint at something older, the broad human tendency to understand new insight as light increasing after darkness. Scholars caution against overreading these passages as deliberate solstice references, but the resemblance to older cultural patterns cannot be ignored. Humans do not need astronomical instruction to feel the connection between light and renewal. The body makes the association long before writing does. In the Mediterranean world, where winter was milder but still carried psychological weight, this connection took on a gentle, contemplative character. Philosophical schools of the time often described the pursuit of wisdom as a gradual return to clarity. Stoic and Neoplatonic teachers use the metaphor of a mind clouded by distraction, slowly clearing over time, much as the pale winter sun rises higher each day after the solstice. Christianity reinterpreted this familiar philosophical language through its own theological lens, framing the child not as an abstract metaphor for enlightenment, but as a concrete expression of the divine choosing to begin in obscurity. This shift gave the tradition an unusual emotional tone. Wisdom did not descend as a blaze of glory, but as the smallest possible flame. This interplay between cultural expectation and theological development created a story that could be understood across social boundaries. In urban congregations, the image of a newborn represented renewal amid political and economic unrest. In rural communities, it resonated with agricultural cycles and the annual rhythm of planting and waiting. Even in regions where winter posed less physical danger, the idea of beginning again in the dark carried its own gravity. The world of late antiquity was filled with transitions, empires dividing, languages shifting, philosophies merging, and the nativity narrative offered a stable point of orientation, not because it answered every question, but because it acknowledged the fragility embedded in every new start. If anything, the enduring power of the symbol lies in its precision. A child does not yet know how to command, to persuade, or to accomplish. A child simply exists, demanding care and slowing time. In this way, early Christian writers discovered a symbol that could hold both personal and communal longing. It invited listeners to imagine a kind of renewal that depends not on triumph, but on patience. A renewal that begins quietly and asks to be tended rather than celebrated. And from that quiet beginning, deeper interpretations emerged in the centuries that followed. Imagine a moment when the earliest readers of Christian writings realized that the story they were holding did not need to happen all at once. Picture a time in the late antique world when parchment moved slowly from hand to hand, when communities read by lamplight, and when the idea of birth began to stretch beyond a single night in Bethlehem. There are passages in the early Christian tradition, especially in the writings found outside the familiar canon, that do not describe spiritual awakening as a sudden event. Instead, they picture it as something gradual, unfolding like the faint brightening of the eastern sky before the sun appears. Even in their most symbolic lines, there is a carefulness, a sense that insight arrives in increments, not flashes. And it is in this quiet territory, where interpretation and experience meet, that the earliest hints of a slow inner dawn take shape. We do not know for certain how widespread these ideas were, but the surviving manuscripts suggest a remarkable pattern. A number of Gnostic and mystical texts treat rebirth as a process requiring practice, attention, and patience. This was not the birth of a child in a stable, and not even the symbolic rebirth recognized in liturgical readings. It was something quieter. Some early Christian writers believed that spiritual awakening resembled the transition from darkness to dawn, a shift that is almost imperceptible until one notices that everything has changed. In these traditions, illumination does not strike like lightning. It gathers. The light inside a person, they argued, grows the same way daylight grows after the winter solstice, returning so slowly that the mind must be trained to notice it. Valentinian theology, for example, which flourished in the 2nd century of the Common Era, is among the clearest expressions of this idea. The Valentinians spoke of spiritual growth as a lifelong unfolding, a movement from ignorance toward understanding that paralleled the cosmic order. Surviving fragments from their teachers refer to the human soul as something that matures, not through one decisive moment, but through a series of recognitions. A minority of scholars have suggested that these patterns mirror the seasonal rhythm familiar to Mediterranean life. The difference between the shortest day and the day that follows is real, but barely measurable. In the same way, a person might undergo transformation without immediately perceiving how the change began. Elsewhere, early homilies preserved in Syriac and Greek use the language of dawn to describe the growth of understanding. They speak of insight as something that dawns in the heart, a phrase that reappears in several regions separated by distance but united by shared metaphors. These writings do not refer to Bethlehem or winter directly, but the imagery they use is unmistakably aligned with the experience of watching the sky lighten after a long night. The homilists seemed less concerned with the historical circumstances of Jesus' birth than with the possibility that each person could experience a similar emergence of clarity. It is not certain that these authors were consciously employing seasonal symbolism, but the linguistic parallels when read across multiple texts are striking. The corpus of Coptic Christian literature, especially the materials preserved in Upper Egyptian monastic communities, introduces another dimension. These texts frequently describe enlightenment as a rising light within the mind or the heart. They do not depict this movement as dramatic. Instead, the language suggests a patient accumulation of insight, often framed within the discipline of ascetic life. One finds metaphors of lamps being trimmed, of rooms being slowly illuminated, and of inner chambers being cleared for light to enter. The emphasis is not on sudden revelation, but on the cultivation of perception. These manuscripts were copied over centuries, and despite significant theological differences between their authors, the imagery of slow inward light remains consistent. A related thread appears in the monastic rules of the early centuries, where spiritual formation is described as a progression rather than a single, transformative encounter. These rules, written for communities attempting to live in ordered harmony, depict the human person as a structure that must be shaped over time. Growth is measured through practice and repetition, silence, labour, vigil, prayer. Each discipline is imagined as a way of clearing shadows from the mind. Some rules even describe the gradual emergence of understanding as a kind of dawn, an image that reappears in different languages across multiple centuries. While these writers rarely comment directly on nativity symbolism, Their metaphors reflect a worldview in which illumination is a process of maturation. Across all these traditions there is a shared pattern. Spiritual insight arrives slowly, layered by experience. None of these texts reject the narrative of Jesus' birth, but they treat the story as a doorway rather than a destination. The infant in the stable is a figure of beginning, not fulfillment. For these authors, birth was something that could occur again and again within a single lifetime, and understanding was something that had to be learned repeatedly. A few modern scholars have noted that this view mirrors the ancient perception of the post-solstice world. Light returns so gradually that its movement must be observed with care. Early Christian texts that emphasize gradual illumination echo that very same rhythm. There is a quietness in these writings that sets them apart from the more public forms of Christianity, emerging in the same centuries. As ecclesiastical structures developed calendars, feast days, and doctrinal boundaries, these contemplative traditions continued to describe spiritual life in terms of slow unfolding. One can sense the tension between external order and internal experience. Yet these internal traditions did not disappear. Instead, they threaded themselves into later theological movements. Medieval mystics, Eastern Christian hesychasts, and even some Renaissance humanists echoed the language of gradual light. They did so not by repeating Gnostic texts directly, but by inheriting the conceptual framework. That transformation is a process. We can glimpse the endurance of this approach when we examine how later Christian communities interpreted the nativity. The celebration of December 25th became increasingly standardized, but the understanding of what birth meant continued to develop. Sermons from the later Middle Ages describe the birth of Christ as something that must occur within each believer, often using language that mirrors the earlier metaphors of dawn. These homilies do not explicitly draw on the Gnostic manuscripts, but the symbolic structures align. The birth of Jesus becomes a pattern for the birth of awareness, and the solstice becomes a backdrop for the movement from darkness to light. When we step back and consider the broader landscape of late antique thought, it becomes clear that these hidden texts were part of a larger conversation about how humans come to understand anything at all. They remind us that spiritual insight was never imagined as instantaneous. It was patterned like the natural world, influenced by the rhythms of season and sky. And whether or not their authors consciously link their metaphors to the winter solstice, the imagery rests on the same ancient human recognition. Light does not return all at once. It grows, and this understanding shaped later Christian thought in subtle ways. A winter evening in a medieval village where the snow has already swallowed the fields, and the breath of every passer-by rises like pale smoke in the cold. In one home, a family gathers around a small carved manger figure, treating it with solemn reverence, speaking of Bethlehem and shepherds, and the night when time itself was believed to have softened. Just down the road, other villagers are lighting fires, singing old songs about returning warmth, and carrying evergreen branches into their homes to remind themselves that the world would survive the cold. One festival, two stories, unfolding in the same streets. This was not unusual in the centuries that followed the rise of Christianity. For a long stretch of the Middle Ages, the season now called Christmas held two currents that moved side by side, neither cancelling the other. There was the historical commemoration anchored in scriptural narrative, and the quieter, older layer of meaning that understood winter as a time when the light within a person needed tending, encouraged, or coaxed back into strength. Both layers survived because they answered different human needs. One gave shape to communal memory and the story of divine incarnation, The other offered guidance through the psychological darkness of the year. For historians, the first sign of these parallel traditions appears in medieval homilies that emphasize spiritual rebirth as much as liturgical observance. In sermons of the early medieval period, particularly those from the 7th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, preachers spoke of Christ's birth as an inner dawn, urging listeners to cultivate gentleness, humility, and a renewed clarity of mind. These texts did not replace the historical nativity. Rather, they presented the external event as a mirror of an inner transformation. When a monk in the Carolingian world wrote that "the light rises within the faithful as surely as the sun rises in winter's depth," he was participating in a long lineage of reflections that understood sacred time as a metaphor for the slow turning of the human heart. It is not entirely clear how widespread these ideas were outside monastic communities, but the surviving manuscripts show that the concept of spiritual rebirth was not confined to a fringe. It was part of the intellectual atmosphere of Christian Europe. Meanwhile, liturgical commentaries from the same period approach the imagery of the season with a different emphasis. They speak of the nativity in relation to darkness not only as metaphor but as theological contrast. To them, the arrival of a child at the coldest and darkest point of the year expressed the notion that divine presence enters precisely where human capacity cannot. In the medieval imagination, the solstice became the stage upon which salvation unfolded. It offered a celestial structure to the narrative of incarnation. The liturgy echoed this association. Candlelight during vigil masses, readings about dawn breaking upon those who sat in darkness, and feast day hymns that likened the infant Christ to the rising sun. None of these elements depended on an exact astronomical correlation, yet they drew upon the emotional resonance of the season. As daylight grew, worshippers could see a reflection of theological renewal in the world around them. Outside the churches and cloisters, however, folk traditions unfolded with their own rhythm. In many parts of Europe, midwinter was a season of communal feasting, visiting, and ritual practices designed to reinforce social bonds during the hardest months of the year. Remnants of older customs persisted, carrying evergreen branches into homes, lighting fires to banish the longest night, and performing songs that invoked warmth, fertility, or protection. These activities did not always align neatly with the theological focus of the liturgical calendar, yet they coexisted, rarely treated as contradictory. The documents that survive from the high and late medieval periods reveal a blend of practices in which Christian and older seasonal customs layered upon one another rather than replacing one another. A villager might attend a nativity mass and later take part in a communal feast whose origins predated Christianity by centuries. The divergence did not fracture the meaning of the season. Instead, it made the festival more adaptable, more able to carry different kinds of hopes. This duality existed not only in Europe but across regions shaped by both Eastern and Western Christian traditions. In the Christian East, Orthodox homilies frequently emphasized the cosmic dimensions of the Incarnation, the union of divine and human nature, while also describing the feast as a renewal of the inner person. Terms like illumination, purification, and awakening appear regularly in writings from Cappadocian and Syriac authors. These were not abstract metaphors detached from ritual. They offered guidance on how to live through a sacred season, reminding believers that the child represented not only historical birth, but the possibility of clarity emerging from confusion. Meanwhile, in the Christian West, theologians like Augustine and later Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of the Nativity as an event unfolding in three layers: the historical birth in Bethlehem, the spiritual birth in the heart, and the final arrival in the eschatological future. This idea provided a conceptual bridge between outward and inward meaning. The nativity was both past and present, both factual and experiential. The endurance of the festival owes much to these parallel threads. On one hand, the historical narrative anchored the date in communal memory, giving societies a shared story around which to gather. On the other, the symbolic dimension, renewal, vulnerability, the return of light, offered a psychological language that could be understood regardless of doctrinal detail. A winter celebration that speaks only to history satisfies the mind, but not always the emotions. One that speaks only to inner renewal risks losing its communal anchor. Christmas remained compelling because it moved along both paths. A person in the 12th century could celebrate the birth of Christ as a factual moment in sacred history, and also feel that the season illuminated their own struggle toward clarity. The outer and inner layers did not compete. They harmonized through repetition. This complexity becomes clearer when we examine how medieval communities wrote about their own participation in the festival. Chronicles and diaries mention liturgies, processions and public gatherings, yet they also describe moments of introspection. One text from 12th century England portrays a monk sitting alone after the midnight mass, reflecting quietly on the rising light as a metaphor for the work of conscience. In another account from the Byzantine world, a writer speaks of carrying light into the chambers of the heart, echoing themes found in much older monastic traditions. These accounts show that ordinary participants absorbed the season's symbolism in ways that went beyond official theology. The festival functioned on multiple registers simultaneously. Later centuries continued this dual thread even as Christian practices diversified. The Renaissance revived interest in the classical world and its concept of cosmic cycles. The Reformation questioned certain liturgical traditions but did not erase the midwinter celebration entirely. Early modern writers reinterpreted the nativity through personal devotion and domestic ritual. Even in these shifting contexts, the motif of light returning to the world persisted. Across all these periods, the two stories, one outward, one inward, remained intertwined. The realization that emerges from this long view is simple, yet surprisingly resilient. Christmas lasted because it was flexible enough to speak to the conditions of the world outside, and deep enough to address the landscape within. It anchored communities through shared ritual, and also provided individuals with a language for renewal. The historical and the metaphorical, the public and the personal, the external and the internal, these were not contradictions but companions, which leads to the question beneath them all. Imagine then how this doubleness appeared not just in elite writings or monastic reflections, but in the everyday rhythm of medieval life. Archaeologists studying seasonal household deposits have found that midwinter gatherings often left behind two distinct kinds of material signatures. In some regions of northern Europe, remnants of communal feasts remain alongside objects associated with small domestic rituals, wax drippings from family candles, fragments of ceramic lamps, carved wooden figures polished from frequent handling. These traces suggest that the season was not solely a public affair anchored in churches and civic spaces. It was also a time when families gathered in quiet corners of their homes, arranging light in places where darkness lingered longest. One cannot know precisely what these private rituals meant to their participants, but their persistence hints that the inward-facing meaning of the season continued in tandem with formal liturgy. In southern regions where winter's severity was gentler, manuscripts from late medieval Spain and Italy reveal another layer, personal meditations written in the margins of prayer books. In some of these, the nativity scene becomes a metaphor for ethical aspiration. A 15th century writer reflects on the humility of the newborn child as an invitation to cultivate patience. Another compares the slow brightening of the morning sky to the gradual clearing of resentment. These notes were never intended for public audiences. They show individuals working through their own interior seasons, using the nativity as a focal point for quiet moral inventory. The story served as a narrative mirror in which people could trace the outline of their hopes and failures during the darkest weeks of the year. Meanwhile, illuminated manuscripts crafted for communal use often portrayed the nativity with deliberate contrasts that highlight the two layers of meaning. Some depict Christ's birth nestled within a stable, but surrounded by expansive cosmic imagery. A rising sun behind the structure, or a star rendered with exaggerated rays that spill into the margins. These artistic choices did not rewrite the theology. They simply made visible a symbolic connection that many medieval viewers would have understood instinctively. Art historians note that such images often pair the infant with a source of light that seems to emanate from outside the scene, reinforcing the dual framing of the story, historically situated yet cosmically resonant. By the later Middle Ages, this dual understanding shaped social rituals as well. Guild processions, for example, combined theological dramas with scenes of domestic charity. In some towns, performers reenacted the Nativity as a narrative of divine humility, while other participants carried lanterns or candles meant to bless the streets during the longest nights. Here again, social life folded together both the communal story and its deeper emotional register. Each procession asked its participants to move through darkness toward a shared place of illumination, a public echo of the inner journey described in monastic writings. This interplay between the outer and inner facets of the festival also affected how medieval communities understood time itself. Calendrical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries frame the weeks around the Nativity as both historical anniversaries and opportunities for inner resetting. One English manuscript describes the season as a hinge of days, a moment when past and present turn together. The phrase may sound poetic, but it reflects a widespread sense that midwinter offered a threshold between endings and beginnings, where communal memory and personal renewal could momentarily align. Even agricultural societies, whose annual rhythms were shaped more by ploughing and harvest than by theological reflection, found meaning in this confluence. Winter was the season when work slowed, when days shortened enough that people spent more time indoors, and when hardship could sharpen self-reflection. The Nativity gave rural communities a vocabulary with which to interpret this pause. The child born in a humble setting did not merely represent divine incarnation. The newborn also carried a reminder that fragility and resilience coexist. Farmers who saw their fields sleeping under frost could resonate with a story that understood new life as something that begins invisibly, long before it becomes visible. Cross-cultural contact in medieval trade networks added yet another dimension. Merchants travelling between the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe recorded in their notebooks that winter celebrations varied widely from port to port, yet they often commented on shared themes: light against darkness, renewal, communal meals, and the presence of children in ceremonial roles. These observations reveal that even when theological differences were significant, the symbolic vocabulary of midwinter held a recognizable shape. Christmas, in other words, became one expression of a broader human response to the coldest weeks of the year, interpreted through a Christian lens but resonant beyond it. In all these layers, liturgical, domestic, artistic, social and economic, the season's meaning rested in its capacity to speak to two spheres at once. It named a historical moment that communities could remember together, anchoring them in a shared lineage, and it provided a metaphorical language for individuals navigating the intimate terrain of loss, hope, fatigue, or longing. The two stories grew alongside each other, strengthening rather than weakening the festival's appeal, which leads to the question beneath them all. A world lit mostly by flame, where winter feels heavier than it does now, and the longest night is not a poetic phrase but a physical weight. Picture a community waiting through the weeks when the sun barely lifts above the horizon, watching the sky for any sign that daylight might stretch just a little longer. Now imagine how powerful a story must be if it can carry that feeling into an age of electric light, crowded cities, and midnight screens. Why does the image of a child born in darkness still settle into our winters as if it has always belonged there? Why do we still pause, consciously or not, when the year reaches its coldest turning? We do not know for certain, but the evidence suggests that much of our modern response to this season is shaped by the same psychological patterns that affected ancient communities. The solstice, with its stark contrast between darkness and the first returning light, offers a structure that cultures have responded to for thousands of years. In recent decades, scholars of religion, anthropology, and literature have traced how this structure continues to appear in contemporary retellings of the nativity, even among communities that do not treat the story as literal history. Many modern interpreters read the birth narrative as a symbol rather than a chronology, describing it as a tale of hope emerging within difficult circumstances, a pattern recognizable far beyond Christian tradition. They suggest that this image resonates because it reflects an emotional reality still familiar to anyone who has lived through seasons of uncertainty. What is striking is how consistently seasonal metaphors continue to appear in contemporary culture. In literary studies, researchers note the persistence of winter as crisis and dawn as renewal motifs across global storytelling, from East Asian poetry to modern European novels. Psychologists studying seasonal affective cycles remark on the enduring association between midwinter and reflection, a period when individuals often report re-evaluating their lives or seeking some form of renewal. Even in secular societies where religious meanings have faded, midwinter remains a time marked by rituals of gathering, feasting, illumination, and symbolic beginnings. These patterns align with a cross-cultural record going back thousands of years, suggesting that the human response to the darkest part of the year has a deep and stable foundation. Anthropologists working across northern and equatorial regions note that midwinter festivals have not disappeared but diversified. In parts of Scandinavia, the late December period continues to host light festivals with origins older than Christianity, reframed in modern civic terms. In Japan, the winter solstice is marked by practices centered on warmth and renewal, such as yuzu baths, emphasizing purification and resilience rather than theological themes. In sections of the Andes, the June solstice in the southern hemisphere remains an anchor point for celebrations tied to agricultural cycles and ancestral memory. These examples show that even when traditions lose their explicit religious meanings, the seasonal framework continues to guide human behavior. The solstice functions as a reminder of cyclical processes larger than any one story, and so it persists. This endurance helps explain why renewal narratives continue to appeal across different cultural contexts. Scholars who analyze global mythology observe that stories of vulnerability leading to strength often cluster around winter markers. These narratives do not always involve children or divine figures. Sometimes they are agricultural metaphors, sometimes they are tales of human communities surviving hardship. But the basic pattern remains. The darkest point is not the end, but the beginning of the return. The Nativity, with its image of infancy placed in midwinter, taps directly into this psychological structure. It positions renewal at the threshold between darkness and returning light, a placement that countless cultures have recognized in different forms long before the narrative took shape. We can also observe how the solstice acts as an emotional anchor even in highly technological societies. Urban planners studying light usage note a measurable increase in communal illumination during December in the Northern Hemisphere, from decorative lights to public installations, which often appear in cities with little or no Christian heritage. Sociologists examining end-of-year rituals find that gatherings, gift-giving, and communal meals rise dramatically during the weeks around the solstice, even in populations where traditional religious practice is declining. These patterns indicate that the human response to seasonal turning points remains remarkably consistent across time. The solstice marks a psychological shift, an awareness that even the coldest darkness contains within it the first sign of return. This continuity may be why the story of a child born in the dark still resonates today. When people describe why the image moves them, they often speak of vulnerability, hope, or the sense that something quietly begins when everything appears still. These responses reflect the core meaning of the solstice itself. In many ways, the narrative gained its lasting power not because it was imposed on the season, but because it aligned so closely with a pattern the season already carried. The symbolic child mirrors the returning light. The silence of the night mirrors the waiting world. The promise of renewal mirrors a cycle older than recorded history. For countless generations, the solstice has been not only an astronomical event, but a human one, shaping emotion, ritual, and imagination. Even in a world where most people no longer track the sun's position across the horizon, the seasonal rhythm still reaches us. The long nights invite reflection. The first lengthening of day carries a subtle relief. Modern life may have diminished the physical stakes of winter, but the psychological landscape remains. We still recognize the turning point, even if we no longer measure it with stone markers or temple alignments. And so the stories that echo this turning continue to hold meaning, long after their historical contexts have changed. In the end, the persistence of these narratives suggests that the solstice is not just an astronomical boundary, but a human one. It marks a shift in attention, in emotion, in the way communities imagine their futures. The child in the story endures because it is not only a figure from history, but a symbol of beginnings, which humans have sought at this time of year for thousands of winters. The story remains because the experience remains. The meaning endures because the cycle endures. Beneath every winter celebration lies an older truth. We still wait for the returning light, just as countless generations did before us. There is also a quieter thread running through modern scholarship. The idea that midwinter becomes meaningful, not because people are consciously thinking about solstices, but because the season still shapes behaviour in subtle ways. Historians studying early modern Europe note that the rural calendar structured emotional life long after industrial work rhythms began to dominate. Winter created pauses in agricultural labour, chances for storytelling, communal gatherings, shared meals, and what some folklorists describe as ritualised rest. When communities later adopted Christian celebrations, these older rhythms provided a ready-made cultural space for a festival centred on new beginnings. The timing felt natural because the human body and the human community were already attuned to quiet, to waiting, and to the slow accumulation of light. Even contemporary studies in chronobiology add an unexpected layer to this understanding. Researchers working on circannual rhythms find that even artificial lighting does not completely override the body's sensitivity to seasonal daylight shifts. Melatonin cycles change subtly in midwinter for populations in northern latitudes, and sleep researchers observe a gentle increase in reflection-oriented dreaming. These findings are not theological claims, but they help explain why stories tied to darkness and renewal still resonate on an emotional level. The body has its own way of noticing the long night, even if the mind is occupied with holiday schedules or urban routines. In cultural anthropology, scholars tracing midwinter rituals across the globe observe an intriguing pattern. Communities tend to place their most introspective celebrations during the period when days begin to lengthen. These festivals may centre on ancestors, on purification, or on the transition from one year to the next, but they often share a sense of threshold. This is visible in Korean Seolal, in South Asian winter harvest observances, and in Peruvian celebrations near the June solstice. Even though these practices differ widely in form and history, they evoke a similar cadence of reflection followed by reorientation. They embody the moment when time feels paused, as if waiting for a new cycle to begin. Modern psychology offers a parallel perspective. Studies of seasonal emotions suggest that people often undertake personal evaluations during midwinter, marking the end of one period and imagining the next. Therapists note that individuals describe this season as a time when the inner world becomes more noticeable, whether through heightened introspection or the quiet desire for fresh beginnings. These patterns do not depend on any particular cultural tradition, which may be why the solstice motif, darkness giving way to light, still feels intuitively meaningful, even for those who never consciously observe the astronomical event. All of this helps explain why midwinter narratives retain their emotional force. The image of a child born in the dark is not simply a symbol inherited from antiquity. It reflects deep, recurring patterns in how humans experience time, landscape, and hope. It speaks to the instinct that life turns, that cycles renew themselves, and that returning light is not just a metaphor but a phenomenon felt in the body and in the shared memory of communities. The story has continued not because people preserved it carefully, but because it fits the season so closely that each new generation recognizes some part of themselves within it,